Gunfire cracks across the dawn-painted Montana wilderness as a lone woman kneels beside her burning home Winchester rifle, balanced against her shoulder with deadly familiarity. Blood trickles from a graze on her temple, but her hands remain steady as steel. She was supposed to be finished with this life, the violence, the legend, the whispered name that once made brave men tremble. 8 years of peace shattered in a single night by men who mistake solitude for weakness. They came hunting a myth, a performer whose shots never missed, whose legend had faded into frontier history. Instead, they found a widow with land worth dying for, with neighbors who stand together with skills that never truly sleep. In a territory where justice teeters on the edge of a bullet, where powerful men rewrite law with blood and silver, her resolve hardens like cooling metal. This isn't just about vengeance or survival. It's about something far more dangerous, a community that refuses to be erased from its own land. The first light of dawn crept across the rolling hills of Blackwater Valley, Montana Territory, 1878. Frost still clung to the tall grass as Rebecca Morgan stood on her cabin porch, Winchester rifle balanced with familiar ease against her shoulder. At 43, her face carried the weathered beauty of a woman who had lived fully fine lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting against prairie sun, and a few strands of silver threading through her chestnut hair. The rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. 300 yards away, tin cans leapt from a fallen log. She lowered the weapon, muscle memory so ingrained she barely registered the action. 8 years had passed since she'd hung up the name Midnight Raven and put away the matched Colts that had made her famous across the western frontier. 8 years since Thomas had convinced her that their future lay here in this valley, building something that would last. Still sharp as ever, a voice called Rebecca turned to see Samuel Chen riding up the path, his 17-year-old son Eli trailing behind. Their family ran the neighboring ranch, 400 acres of prime grazing land that Samuel had purchased with Rebecca and Thomas's help when other landowners refused to sell to a Chinese immigrant. "Old habits," Rebecca replied, setting the rifle against the porch rail. "What brings you by so early?" Samuel's usually warm expression was troubled. "News from Willow Creek raiders hit the Donovan place last night, took their best horses, burned the stables." Rebecca felt a familiar tension grip her spine. "Anybody hurt? Donovan's oldest boy caught a bullet in the shoulder. He'll live." Samuel paused. "There's more. The men were organized, military-like, and they destroyed all the breeding records before they left. Bastards knew what they were doing." Eli added, "Weren't just common bandits." Rebecca's gaze drifted to the corral where Eclipse, a powerful black Arabian stallion, paced restlessly, Thomas's final gift to her before the fever took him 3 years ago. A horse of exceptional bloodline and intelligence, worth more than most men would see in a lifetime. "You heard about Carson's place last month?" Samuel asked quietly. "And the Peterson ranch before that?" Rebecca nodded slowly. "Thought it was bad luck." 3 ranches in 2 months isn't luck," Samuel said. "And there's something else, they're targeting places with connections to William Cody's Wild West show." He watched her face carefully. Peterson supplied horses. Carson used to be a trick shooter. Rebecca felt ice form in her stomach. 8 years she'd been Rebecca Morgan, respected widow and rancher. Before that, for a decade, she'd been the Midnight Raven, the most celebrated female sharpshooter in Cody's traveling extravaganza. "You think they're coming here next?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I think you should be careful," Samuel replied. "Whatever's happening, it feels personal." As Samuel and Eli rode away, Rebecca watched Eclipse in the corral, suddenly understanding his agitation. The stallion sensed what she now felt in her bones, danger approaching. She turned toward the cabin, decision made in the bedroom. She knelt before an old cedar chest, untouched for years. Inside lay the black leather riding outfit with silver concho that had once been her trademark, and beneath it the matched Colt peacemakers that had made her legend. Rebecca ran her fingers along the smooth ivory grips, remembering the Midnight Raven had been born of necessity after her father's death left her penniless at 19. Her uncanny skill with firearms had been her ticket out of poverty. And now it might be the only thing standing between her and men who destroyed everything they touched. Willow Creek's dusty main street was busier than usual, When Rebecca wrote in the following day, news of the raids had traveled fast, bringing with it a current of fear that hummed beneath everyday conversations. She tied eclipse outside Henderson's general store, aware of the whispers that followed her. Even after 8 years, some still remembered the woman who could split playing cards at 30 paces while riding at full gallop. Inside, Rebecca found Sarah Garrett sorting through medical supplies. The young woman had studied back east before returning to establish the territory's first proper medical practice run by a woman many hadn't approved, but Rebecca had offered her a place to stay until she found her footing. "Wasn't expecting to see you in town today," Sarah said, marking items in her ledger. "Needed supplies," Rebecca replied, though both knew it wasn't the whole truth. "How's the Donovan boy? Healing clean, shot through the muscle?" Sarah lowered her voice. The raiders knew exactly what they wanted. Rebecca took only the blooded stock, left the workhorses. The boys said their leader moved like military, gave hand signals, positioned men with precision. Rebecca nodded, feeling the pieces align. Samuel mentioned they're targeting people connected to the Wild West show. "There's more," Sarah said, glancing around before continuing. "The ranch hand who recognized one of the raiders found dead yesterday morning, shot in the back on his way to the sheriff's office." Cold certainty settled in Rebecca's bones. Professional work. Marshall Walker's forming a posse, but posses aren't trained for this kind of fight, Rebecca finished. The store's bell jangled as Abigail Turner, who ran the telegraph office, burst in. "Rebecca, thank goodness you're here. Got a message I think you should see." She thrust a telegram toward Rebecca, who scanned it quickly. "Captain Edmund Bishop." Rebecca read aloud, "That name mean anything to you?" Sarah shook her head, but Abigail's expression darkened. "Army officer dishonorably discharged after that massacre in Dakota Territory. Blamed his scouts when his poor judgment got half his company killed." Rebecca remembered now stories that had reached them, even in the isolation of Blackwater Valley. "What's he got to do with this?" "Marshall got word from Fort Richardson. Bishop's been identified leading a gang of horse thieves moving north from Colorado, 20 men, at least all ex-military." Abigail hesitated. "There's something else. The telegram mentions Bishop has a particular interest in former show performers, especially sharpshooters." Rebecca felt the room go still. Bishop, the name stirred something in her memory, a military exhibition in St. Louis years ago. A proud cavalry officer challenging her to a shooting contest, claiming no woman could match his skill. His humiliation when she'd bested him had been complete. "You know him," Sarah said, reading her expression. "We met once," Rebecca answered carefully. "He wasn't the kind of man who takes defeat well, especially from a woman." Outside, a commotion drew their attention. Through the window, Rebecca saw Marshall Walker conferring with several deputies, his expression grim. "They found tracks," Abigail explained. "A large party moving through Carson's Pass, heading this way." Rebecca caught Sarah's worried glance. "They're coming faster than we thought." As she stepped onto the boardwalk, Rebecca was intercepted by Jacob Turner, who'd been running the barber shop since before she arrived in the valley. "Mrs. Morgan," he said quietly, drawing her aside. "Thought you might want to see this." From inside his vest, he withdrew a yellow-edged theatrical poster. The image showed a woman in black riding leathers standing beside a pale horse twin. Colts drawn, the Midnight Raven, the most celebrated markswoman in the West. "Where did you get this?" Rebecca asked, her voice tight. "Kept it from the old days. Thing is, saw 2 strangers at the saloon last night asking questions. One had a copy of this poster." Jacob's voice dropped lower. "If Bishop is holding a grudge against you, then he knows exactly who he's hunting," Rebecca finished. The ride back to her ranch was tense. Her mind working through scenarios, assessing threats, calculating odds, skills she'd once applied to theatrical performances, now turned to survival. As the cabin came into view, Rebecca made out a figure waiting on her porch. Marshal David Walker stood as she approached his weathered face grave beneath his hat brim. "Rebecca," he greeted her, "we need to talk about Captain Edmund Bishop." Night had fallen by the time Marshal Walker departed, leaving Rebecca alone with troubling revelations. Bishop's gang had systematically targeted former show performers across 3 territories, leaving destruction in their wake. What had appeared as random horse thefts was actually a calculated campaign of revenge against anyone connected to the exhibition where Bishop had been humiliated. 10 years, Rebecca muttered to herself, stoking the cabin fire. 10 years, nursing a grudge. She moved to the window, scanning the darkness. The ranch lay quiet, too quiet. Even the night birds had fallen silent. Rebecca extinguished the oil lamp and retrieved her rifle, moving to the porch with practiced stealth. For 20 minutes, she waited motionless as the shadows lengthened. Then a flicker of movement near the southern pasture fence. Rebecca raised her spyglass, focusing on the spot. Two men crouched in the tall grass, studying the ranch layout scouts. Her first instinct was to drop them both, but experience cautioned patience. These weren't the main force, just the eyes Bishop would be watching from somewhere else, waiting for his scout's report. Rebecca slipped back inside, changing quickly into dark trousers and shirt. She plaited her hair tightly, then retrieved her old performer's knife from the cedar chest, a silver blade balanced for throwing another relic from her show days. Outside again, she circled wide around the property, using the terrain she knew intimately to approach the scouts from behind. The men were professional, but they were hunting a woman they believed to be a retired performer, not someone who'd spent 8 years learning every contour of this land. She was 15 feet away when she heard their whispered conversation. "Waste of time," the first man grumbled. "Should be hitting the main ranch, not watching some woman's little spread." "Captain's order," replied the second, "said she's more dangerous than she looks." That old woman heard she was something in the show days, but that was... Rebecca's knife blade pressed against the first man's throat, silencing him mid-sentence. "That was a long time ago," she finished for him, her voice deadly soft. "But some skills you don't forget." The second man reached for his pistol, freezing when he felt cold steel against his ear. "That would be a mistake," Rebecca said evenly. "Now you boys are going to tell me exactly what Captain Bishop has planned for my valley." 20 minutes later, Rebecca watched the scouts stumble away, thoroughly disarmed and shaken. She hadn't killed them. Dead men couldn't deliver messages. "Tell your captain," she'd instructed, "that the Midnight Raven wasn't just a stage name, it was a promise." Dawn found Rebecca riding hard for Samuel Chen's ranch, the scouts' information burning in her mind. Bishop's main force, 28 men, was encamped just beyond Serpent Ridge. They planned to hit 3 ranches simultaneously the following night, creating enough chaos to mask their real target. Her Bishop wasn't just after her horses. He wanted her dead an example to anyone who'd ever witnessed his humiliation. As she crested the final rise overlooking the Chen property, Rebecca saw Samuel and Eli already working in the corral. They looked up at her approach immediately, reading the urgency in her posture. "We've got trouble," she called out, dismounting in a fluid motion that belied her years. "Bishop's men are closer than we thought." Samuel's face hardened as she relayed what she'd learned. When she finished, he turned to his son. "Eli, ride to the Harrington place, then the Whitfords tell them to gather what they can carry and move to the North Valley cave system by nightfall." "You think it'll come to that?" Rebecca asked once Eli had departed. Samuel's expression was grim. "Bishop doesn't sound like a man who'll be satisfied with a few horses. Men like that with military training and a taste for revenge, they'll burn everything we've built here." Rebecca nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I didn't come here to ask you to fight my battles, Samuel." A rare smile crossed his weathered face. "No, you came to warn us. But that's the thing about this valley, Rebecca. We stand together." He gestured toward the surrounding landscape. "My grandfather had a saying, 'The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives.' Bishop thinks he's hunting individuals. He doesn't understand what he's really facing." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 5 riders appeared, the Harrington brothers followed by Michael Whitford and his sons. Word had already spread. "Heard you might need some help, Mrs. Morgan," the eldest Harrington called out. Tipping his hat, Rebecca felt something tighten in her chest. For 8 years, she'd kept the Midnight Raven locked away, believing that chapter of her life closed. Now, with danger approaching her neighbors, the community she and Thomas had helped build were rallying, not to the legend, but to the woman they knew. "Bishop's coming," she said simply, And he's not coming alone. Sana, neither are you. Michael Whitford replied, his voice carrying the same determination that had helped him build the valley's largest cattle operation from nothing. As they gathered to plan, Rebecca realized that Bishop's first miscalculation was already apparent. He thought he was hunting a lone performer past her prime. Instead, he was marching into a valley where every resident knew the land intimately and had spent years helping each other survive everything the frontier threw at them. The Midnight Raven might have been one woman, but Rebecca Morgan was part of something stronger, a community bound by loyalty and respect, and together they were about to teach Captain Edmund Bishop why some legends were best left undisturbed. The silver moon hung low over Blackwater Valley as Rebecca completed her final preparations. 3 days had passed since she'd confronted Bishop's scouts. 3 days of constant vigilance as the valley's residents implemented their defense strategy. Families with young children had been evacuated to the cave system in the northern mountains, while those who remained fortified strategic positions and established communication networks. Rebecca pulled on her old performance gloves, the leather still supple after years in the cedar chest. She'd modified her famous outfit, removing the flashy silver conchos that would catch moonlight and replacing them with matte leather reinforcements that Thomas had helped design years ago. This wasn't about showmanship anymore. Sarah Garrett entered the cabin without knocking, medical bag in hand. Signal from Harrington's Ridge. She reported movement at the South Pass, large group moving cautiously. Rebecca nodded, checking her Colts one final time. How many? At least 15. Michael's boys counted 5 more at Serpent Creek. Bishop splitting his forces, hitting multiple points. Rebecca's voice was calm, analytical, trying to stretch us thin. Sarah watched as Rebecca slid extra ammunition into specialized pockets. You really think he'll come himself? Most men like him send others to do their dirty work. That's the thing about wounded pride, Rebecca replied, securing her knife at her belt. It demands personal satisfaction. Bishop needs to be the one who brings down the Midnight Raven. It's all he's thought about for 10 years. A low whistle from outside signaled Samuel's arrival. Rebecca stepped onto the porch to find him accompanied by Eli and 2 other young men from neighboring homesteads. Everything's set, Samuel reported. Supplies cached, horses secured in the North Valley. If they're after bloodstock, they'll find only cold trails and empty stables. Rebecca's gaze drifted to Eclipse, still in his corral. They debated moving the stallion with the others, but Rebecca had made the final decision. He stays, she'd insisted. Bishop will expect him here, and I want Bishop focused on exactly what I want him to see. Now in the pale moonlight, Eclipse's black coat gleamed like polished onyx. The stallion sensed the tension his movements controlled, but alert, a perfect reflection of his mistress. Remember, Rebecca addressed the small gathering, this isn't about heroics. Bishop's men are trained soldiers. We let them come into the valley thinking they have surprise on their side. We keep them off balance, make them waste ammunition on ghosts. Like the Apache. Samuel nodded, understanding. His father had told stories of watching how native tribes had turned to rain against larger forces. Exactly. Rebecca checked her timepiece. The signal fires are ready? Eli nodded. Just waiting for your word. Good. Once their main force is committed, we light them all at once. Make them think they're surrounded. She turned to Sarah. You stay at the meeting point. Anyone gets hurt, they come to you. Sarah hesitated, then handed Rebecca a small pouch. Medicines, just in case. The sound of distant hoofbeats caused them all to freeze. Rebecca raised her spyglass, scanning the southern approach. Through the magnified lens, she made out riders moving with military precision through the moonlit landscape. They're earlier than expected, Samuel whispered. Rebecca's mind calculated rapidly. They must have scouts in place already watching our preparations. She made a swift decision. Change of plans. Samuel, get everyone to fall back to secondary positions. I'll draw their attention here. Rebecca, Samuel began to protest. They're expecting to find me here. Let's not disappoint them. Her voice held the steel that had made the Midnight Raven legend. But they're expecting a performer, not a strategist. That's our advantage. As the others melted away into the darkness, Rebecca positioned herself on the cabin porch, rifle propped casually beside her. She lit an oil lamp, adjusting its flame to cast her silhouette clearly against the cabin wall. a target too tempting to ignore. Through her spyglass, she watched Bishop's men spread out their movements, betraying military training. They approached with caution, clearly expecting resistance. What they weren't expecting was the complete silence that greeted them. No barking dogs, no warning shots. Rebecca counted 15 riders approaching her property, with others likely circling to other positions. Their leader mounted on a distinctive white stallion held back beyond rifle range, directing his men with hand signals. Even at this distance, Rebecca recognized Edmund Bishop. His posture remained rigid with military bearing, but there was something else now, a brittleness to his movements that spoke of obsession hardened into hatred. "Come on, Captain," she whispered, adjusting her position slightly to ensure her silhouette remained visible. 8 years I've been preparing for men like you. Let's see if you've learned anything since St. Louis. Bishop's voice carried across the night air, confident and commanding. "Secure the perimeter. I want that stallion and the woman alive." Rebecca smiled coldly as his men moved into position exactly as she'd anticipated. From the darkness beyond the property, she caught the briefest flash. Samuel's signal that everyone was in place. Bishop's men were so focused on the cabin that none noticed the subtle movements in the surrounding hills where the residents of Blackwater Valley waited like patient wolves. The trap was set. Now it was time to show Captain Edmund Bishop the difference between theatrical performance and frontier justice. The first shot, when it came, wasn't fired by Rebecca or Bishop's men. A single rifle crack echoed from the ridgeline, followed by the metallic ping of a bullet striking one of Bishop's supply wagons. A carefully placed warning, demonstrating both skill and restraint. Through her glass, Rebecca watched confusion ripple through Bishop's forces. The captain himself stiffened, scanning the darkness. "Who fired that shot?" he demanded, voice cutting through the night. Rebecca chose that moment to step fully into view, her silhouette unmistakable against the lamplight. "That would be my neighbors, Captain." She called out, her voice carrying easily in the still air. "Turns out I'm not as alone as you might have hoped." The game had begun. Rebecca remained motionless on the porch, calculating distances and angles. Bishop's forces had committed themselves to the open ground before her cabin, exactly where she wanted them. "Well, well," Bishop called out, recovering his composure. "The famous Midnight Raven hiding behind farmers and ranchers. Not exactly the legend I remember." "And yet here you are, Captain," Rebecca replied evenly. "A decorated officer reduced to raiding homesteads and killing innocent men. I'd say we've both changed." Even from a distance, she could see Bishop's face contort with rage. "You have no idea what you took from me that day in St. Louis." He snarled, "One performance and my career, my reputation, everything I'd built gone. You did that to yourself," Rebecca countered. "I just pulled the trigger." Bishop's laugh held no humor, still sharp-tongued. "Let's see if you're still as sharp with those famous Colts." He raised his hand and his men quickly formed a firing line. "You have 1 minute to surrender yourself and that black stallion. After that, we burn everything and everyone you care about." Rebecca didn't move. "You might want to reconsider that, Captain. Look around you." As if on cue, signal fires ignited across the surrounding ridges, illuminating the night with dancing flames that made it impossible to determine how many watchers might be positioned in the heights. The choreographed display had the intended effect. Bishop's men shifted nervously, suddenly aware of their exposure. Rebecca used their distraction to melt into the shadows beside the cabin, her movement so fluid she seemed to vanish. The training that had once delighted audiences now served a deadlier purpose as she circled behind the barn, positioning herself for what would come next. "Find her," Bishop ordered, his voice edged with desperation. "Search every building." 3 men advanced toward the cabin, rifles ready. From her hidden position, Rebecca waited until the precise moment when 2 broke off toward the barn, while the third approached the cabin door. With practiced accuracy, she fired twice, not to kill but to disarm. The men dropped their weapons with startled cries of pain, clutching wrists and shoulders. Chaos erupted as Bishop's remaining forces returned fire bullets, splintering wood where Rebecca had been moments before. But she was already moving again, using routes she'd carefully mapped during long years of preparing for threats just like this. From the surrounding ridges, rifle fire erupted, controlled bursts from the valley's defenders that targeted weapons rather than men, forcing Bishop's soldiers to scatter and seek cover that wasn't there. "She's making fools of us," one of Bishop's lieutenants growled, ducking beside his commander as bullets kicked up dirt around them. Bishop's face was a mask of frustration. "She's not alone. The whole valley's supporting her. We could pull back, regroup." "No," Bishop hissed. "I've waited too long for this new plan." He issued rapid orders, and his men began to fall back toward the tree line, dragging their wounded comrades. Rebecca observed their retreat from her concealed position, sensing the tactical adjustment. This wasn't a full withdrawal. Bishop was too obsessed for that. He was regrouping, preparing for a different approach. Sure enough, as his men reached the relative safety of the trees, Bishop raised his voice once more. "You've trained them well, Raven, but let's see how your little community responds to this." At his signal, flaming arrows arced through the night sky, landing in the dry grass surrounding the cabin. The autumn-cured vegetation caught immediately, lines of fire racing outward in all directions. "He's trying to smoke us out." Samuel's voice came from nearby as he materialized beside Rebecca. "Cut off our escape routes." Rebecca nodded grimly, watching the flames spread. "It's what I would do. We need to get to the high ground before we're surrounded." As they moved, the distinctive crack of a long-range rifle split the night. Rebecca felt the bullet pass inches from her head before thudding into the barn wall behind her. "Sharpshooter," she muttered, dropping into a crouch and pulling Samuel down with her. "Military trained." Through her spyglass, she located the sniper positioned on a ridge 200 yards distant, far enough that most shooters would consider him safely out of effective range. Rebecca didn't hesitate. Drawing one of her Colts, she took careful aim, compensating for distance and the slight evening breeze. Her shot cracked out and the sniper jerked backward, his rifle tumbling down the rocky slope. "Jesus!" Samuel breathed. "You hit him at that distance with a handgun. Wounded his shoulder," Rebecca corrected. "Can't have him picking off our people." She scanned the spreading fires. "Bishop's using this as cover to reposition. We need to move now." They retreated toward their secondary defensive positions, where others from the valley waited. The initial engagement had gone largely as planned. They'd surprised Bishop's forces, demonstrated their preparedness, and forced him to waste resources. But Rebecca knew this was just the opening move in what would be a much longer and deadlier game. Bishop had underestimated her once in St. Louis. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The night was still young, and the real battle for Blackwater Valley had only just begun. As Rebecca joined the others at their fallback position, she caught sight of the fires now encircling her cabin. Thomas had built that home for them, crafting each beam and board with his own hands. Now it would likely burn to the ground. One more casualty of Bishop's obsession. She pushed aside the personal loss, focusing instead on what mattered now, keeping her people alive and ending this threat permanently. The Midnight Raven hadn't just been famous for hitting targets. She'd been known for her ability to plan 3 moves ahead. Tonight, that skill would mean the difference between life and death for everyone in Blackwater Valley. The fires burned well into the night, transforming Rebecca's ranch into an island of flame, visible for miles. From their position in the high forest overlooking the valley, she and the others watched Bishop's men establish a perimeter around the property, apparently content to let the fire finish what they'd started. "They think they've won the first round," Michael Whitford observed, his weathered face illuminated by the distant blaze. "Forcing us to abandon your ranch." Rebecca nodded, her expression unreadable as she watched her home burn. "That's exactly what I want them to think." Sarah approached, having finished tending to Eli Chen, who'd suffered a minor bullet graze while helping evacuate the Harrington children. "Bishop's pulled most of his forces back to that camp near Serpent Ridge. She reported left about 10 men to watch the fires and make sure we don't double back. He's conserving strength," Rebecca concluded, preparing for a longer campaign than he initially planned. She turned to the gathered defenders, 15 men and women from across the valley armed with rifles and determination. "We've shown him we won't be easy targets. Now he'll try to isolate us, cut us off from resources." "What's our next move?" Samuel asked Rebecca, spread out a hand-drawn map of the valley on a flat rock. "Bishop thinks he knows what he's facing, a retired performer with some loyal neighbors. What he doesn't realize is that we've been preparing for threats like this since Thomas and I first settled here. She indicated a series of locations marked across the valley. Supply caches, hidden trails, observation posts all established over the years. Bishops trying to use military tactics in terrain that doesn't favor them. That's all well and good, Michael interjected, but he still has us outnumbered with better weapons and training. Error. Which is why we don't fight him directly, Rebecca replied. We use what we have that he doesn't intimate knowledge of this land and every secret it holds. As they refined their strategy, a commotion at the perimeter drew their attention. Marshal Walker approached accompanied by a young deputy. You're a hard woman to find in the dark. Mrs. Morgan, he said, removing his hat as he joined their circle. That's rather the point. Marshal, Rebecca replied. What brings you up here? Thought you'd be organizing your posse. Walker's expression was grim. Posse is standing down. Got word from the territorial capital this afternoon. They're not sending reinforcements. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the group. Why the hell not? Michael demanded. Walker hesitated, then produced an official-looking document. Orders saying that Captain Bishop is operating with authorization to recover stolen Army property. That's absurd, Sarah cut in. What's stolen property? According to these papers, bloodstock horses that supposedly belong to the cavalry breeding program. Walker's disgust was evident. It's all horse shit. Of course, Bishop's got friends in high places willing to cover for him. Rebecca studied the document, something clicking into place. This isn't just about me, she said slowly. Bishop's using his vendetta as cover for something bigger. Walker nodded. Been asking around. Bishop's gang has hit over 20 ranches across 3 territories in the past year. Always the same pattern, take the best horses, destroy breeding records, burn what they can't carry. He's not just stealing horses, Rebecca realized. He's systematically destroying bloodlines, eliminating competition. For what? Samuel asked. Rebecca turned to Sarah. Those documents you found in the telegraph office, the ones mentioning mining interests in the valley, I think they're connected. Sarah's eyes widened. The survey maps, they showed potential silver deposits running right through this area. And silver mining requires what? Rebecca prompted. Land, Michael answered, understanding, dawning, empty land, free of ranchers and homesteaders. Rebecca traced a path across the map. Bishop's not just settling an old score. He's clearing the valley for someone else, someone with the influence to forge army documents and block law enforcement intervention. Chiru, Walker looked deeply troubled. If that's true, killing or capturing Bishop won't be enough. We need proof of who's really behind this. Rebecca turned to the deputy who had accompanied Walker. Tommy, isn't it Judge Morrison's nephew? The young man nodded, surprised at being addressed directly. Your uncle still has those connections in the territorial capital. People who can't be bought. Yes, ma'am, Uncle Josiah always says. Good, Rebecca interrupted. Because we're going to need them. She turned back to the map. Bishop's just the weapon, someone else is aiming him. Someone who sees our homes as obstacles to wealth. As the implications sank in, Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on her shoulders. This wasn't just about defending her reputation or even her neighbors anymore. The entire future of Blackwater Valley hung in the balance. The firelight cast long shadows as she outlined her expanded plan. A coordinated effort not just to repel Bishop's forces, but to uncover the conspiracy behind them. Each person was assigned specific tasks based on their skills and knowledge of the terrain. Remember, Rebecca concluded, Bishop expects us to think like desperate homesteaders defending our land. Instead, we need to think like hunters tracking dangerous prey. As the group dispersed to their positions, Samuel lingered. You knew, didn't you? Even before Walker showed up with those papers, you suspected this was bigger than Bishop's grudge. Rebecca's gaze returned to the distant fires where her home continued to burn. Thomas used to say that men like Bishop are never truly their own masters. They're too consumed by bitterness to see when they're being used. And the real masters, Rebecca checked her weapons with practiced efficiency. They're about to learn that Blackwater Valley isn't as isolated or defenseless as they imagined. She holstered her Colts with a decisive click. Before this is over, we'll know exactly who set Bishop on our trail, and they'll wish they'd never heard of the Midnight Raven. Dawn painted the eastern ridges with pale gold as Rebecca observed Bishop's camp through her spyglass. After the previous night's confrontation, his forces had consolidated their position, establishing defensible perimeters, and posting sentries in a pattern that betrayed military precision. They've adapted quickly, Samuel noted, crouched beside her in the concealment of a pine thicket. Setting up proper field positions, rotating watches. Rebecca nodded, studying the camp's layout. Bishop was always a competent tactician. It was his judgment that was flawed. She shifted her focus to a figure emerging from the largest tent, Bishop himself conferring with several lieutenants. Even at this distance, his rigid posture and sharp gestures revealed a man maintaining control through force of will. Their observation was interrupted by Michael Whitford's arrival. The rancher moved with remarkable stealth for his size, a skill honed through years of hunting in these mountains. Riders approaching from the south. He reported, not more of Bishop's men, different clothing, civilian but expensive. 4 of them with an escort. Rebecca exchanged glances with Samuel, the masters making an appearance. They relocated to a ridge overlooking the southern approach. Through her glass, Rebecca studied the newcomers, men whose tailored clothing and confident postures suggested wealth and influence. The leader, a silver-haired man with a patrician bearing, rode slightly ahead of the others. "Judge Morrison's here," Tommy announced, joining them with news from the valley. "Uncle says we need to be careful. That's Harold Blackwood riding at the front." Blackwood, Rebecca's attention sharpened. "The mining magnate from Helena." Tommy nodded. "Uncle says he's been buying up properties all through the territory. Got the governor's ear and half the territorial assembly in his pocket." Rebecca watched as Bishop's men escorted Blackwood's party into the camp. The greeting between Bishop and Blackwood was cordial, but not warm, the relationship of employer and useful tool. Not allies. "We need to hear what they're saying," Rebecca decided. "Tommy, find the highest point with a clear view of that central tent. Samuel, get word to the others we hold our positions for now." While they dispersed, Rebecca circled down through a hidden ravine, approaching Bishop's camp from the blind side, where sentinel positions were spaced too far apart. Years of performance riding had taught her how to move silently, and Thomas had shown her how to use terrain to mask her approach. By mid-morning, she was positioned behind an outcropping less than 70 yards from Bishop's command tent, close enough to hear the raised voices within. "Costing me valuable time and resources." Blackwood was saying, his cultured tones carrying a sharp edge. "This valley should have been cleared 3 days ago. These people are more organized than anticipated." Bishop replied, defensive but still deferential. "They know the terrain, have established communication networks." "Excuses." Blackwood cut him off. "I didn't finance your operation because I wanted excuses, Captain. I have investors arriving in Helena next week, expecting to see progress on our silver extraction plans." "We'll have them cleared by then," Bishop insisted. "I've sent for additional men from our Colorado operation." "See that you do. Remember, I need legally defensible removal. Either they sell their land under pressure, or they're found to be harboring criminals, or they simply disappear in unfortunate accidents." Blackwood's voice hardened. "The method concerns me less than the result." "And the Morgan woman?" Bishop asked, a new tension in his voice. A pause. "Your personal vendetta is becoming a liability. Captain, I allowed it because your obsession with her made you useful. But if you can't separate your grudge from our business arrangement—" "I'll handle Morgan," Bishop interrupted. "That's not in question." "Good, because the documents are already prepared. Once the current occupants are removed, the land transfers proceed as planned. The territorial office has been adequately compensated to expedite approval." Rebecca had heard enough. She retreated the way she'd come, mind racing with the implications of what she'd discovered. By the time she rejoined the others at their fallback position, a plan was already forming. "It's worse than we thought," she told the gathered defenders. "Blackwood isn't just after the silver deposits. He's creating a template buy or drive out small landholders, fabricate legal cover, then repeat the process across the territory." We're the test case, Samuel realized. If he can clear Blackwater Valley, then no independent community is safe, Rebecca finished. Blackwood's building an empire piece by piece. Judge Morrison, a stern-faced man in his 60s, had arrived during Rebecca's absence. He examined the documents Marshall Walker had provided. These land transfer forms are genuine territorial instruments, but they've been modified, he pointed to several sections. Pre-signed dates left blank. Once the current owners are gone, they simply fill in the details and file the paperwork, making it appear that we sold our land willingly, Michael said, disgust evident in his voice, or that it was seized legally due to criminal activity. The judge added, which explains why Bishop's men have been planting evidence of stolen Army property. Rebecca turned to Walker. Marshal, how fast can you get word to Fort Richardson? The real Fort Richardson, not whoever forged those orders. 2 days hard ride, Walker replied, but there's no guarantee they'll intervene in what appears to be a civil matter. They will when they see these. Rebecca produced a packet of letters she'd recovered from Bishop's destroyed supply wagon during the night. Orders bearing forged Army seals, requisition forms for military supplies, diverted to private use correspondence with territorial officials. She allowed herself a small smile. Bishop may be obsessed, but he's also meticulous. Keeps records of everything, including who's been paid to look the other way. Judge Morrison examined the documents with growing outrage. This is enough to bring charges against half the territorial government. Only if it reaches the right hands, Rebecca cautioned. Blackwood's influence runs deep. Sarah, who had been tending to several wounded defenders, joined the discussion. We can't hold out indefinitely. Bishop's reinforcements will arrive within days, and we're already running low on ammunition. Rebecca studied the valley map where they'd marked Bishop's positions and their own defensive fallback points. We need to change the equation. She said finally, force Blackwood to reveal himself, make this too public for his political allies to protect him. How do we do that? Samuel asked Rebecca, traced a path across the map. We let Bishop think he's winning, draw his forces into pursuing us while we evacuate the remaining families. Meanwhile, we get these documents to Fort Richardson and the Territorial Marshal's office. That's risky, Walker objected. If something goes wrong, it's our only play. Rebecca interrupted. Bishop wants me. That makes me the perfect distraction while the rest of you implement the real plan. She outlined the strategy, a carefully orchestrated withdrawal that would appear as a retreat but actually served to position their people exactly where they needed to be. Each person's role was critical, from the youngest able-bodied teenager to the eldest homesteader. This isn't just about saving our homes anymore, Rebecca concluded. It's about stopping Blackwood before he can do to other communities what he's trying to do to us. As the meeting broke up, Samuel drew Rebecca aside. You're putting yourself directly in Bishop's path, he said quietly. That's a dangerous game. It's the game he started, Rebecca replied, but I'm changing the rules. She turned to check on Eclipse, who had been brought to their secure location during the night. The stallion greeted her with a gentle nudge, seemingly untroubled by the chaos around him. Bishop thinks he's hunting the Midnight Raven, Rebecca said, running a hand along the horse's powerful neck. I'm going to remind him why that was never a wise idea. Midday heat shimmered across the open meadow as Rebecca, mounted on Eclipse, emerged from the tree line. At the far end of the clearing, Bishop's patrol, 8 men who had been tracking movement along the eastern ridge, pulled up sharply at the sight of her. She made no attempt to hide or flee, allowing them a clear view of her silhouette against the bright sky. Even at this distance, she knew they would recognize the distinctive black riding outfit and twin Colts holstered at her hips, the full regalia of the Midnight Raven that hadn't been seen in nearly a decade. That's far enough, gentlemen, she called out when they began to advance. I'm here to speak with your captain. The patrol leader, a hard-faced man with a lieutenant's bearing, regarded her suspiciously. You're surrendering, Rebecca laughed, the sound carrying clearly across the meadow. Hardly. I'm proposing a resolution that doesn't end with more of your men in graves or hospital beds. The lieutenant conferred briefly with his men, then nodded. You'll come with us, but you'll relinquish those weapons first. I don't think so, Rebecca replied pleasantly. Your captain wants to settle an old score. Tell him I'm willing to do that, just him and me. Shooter against shooter like it was meant to be. And why would he agree to that? Rebecca smiled coldly. Because he's been dreaming of this moment for 10 years, and because the alternative is watching his operation fall apart piece by piece as we bleed his forces dry in terrain they don't understand. While the lieutenant dispatched a rider to deliver her message, Rebecca remained motionless atop Eclipse, projecting a confidence that masked the calculated risk she was taking. Everything depended on Bishop's obsession overwhelming his tactical judgment. Within an hour, Bishop himself arrived with a larger contingent of men. He halted 30 yards away, studying her with undisguised hatred, and beneath it a grudging respect. The famous Midnight Raven, he called out, finally emerges from hiding. I was never hiding, Captain, Rebecca replied evenly, simply waiting for you to make enough mistakes that stopping you became necessary. Bishop's face tightened at the insult. You've lost your home, your ranch is ashes, and your neighbors are scattered or dead. Yet you speak of stopping me. Interesting that you mention neighbors, Rebecca said, shifting slightly in her saddle to maintain Bishop's full attention. While you've been focused on settling an old grudge, they've been quite busy. She nodded toward the western ridge where signal fires had begun to erupt in a sequential pattern. Bishop's head snapped around to follow her gaze, momentarily distracted. What game are you playing? He demanded, turning back to her. The same one you started in St. Louis. Rebecca answered, only this time the stakes are somewhat higher. Behind Bishop, one of his lieutenants approached with urgent news. Rebecca couldn't hear the whispered conference, but Bishop's expression confirmed what she already knew. The diversion was working. Somewhere in the valley, Samuel and the others were implementing their part of the plan, drawing attention away from the real objective, problems with your operation. Captain, she inquired innocently. Bishop's composure slipped further. This changes nothing. You're alone, outnumbered, with nowhere to run. Am I? Rebecca glanced meaningfully at the surrounding terrain, where nothing moved but shadows in the wind. You still don't understand what you're really facing, do you? This isn't about you and me anymore. It's about something far larger. Enough! Bishop snapped. You want a reckoning? Find tomorrow at dawn the meadow beyond Serpent Ridge. Just you and me, a shooting contest like the one you so enjoyed in St. Louis. His smile held no warmth. Only this time there won't be an audience to save you. Dawn it is, Rebecca agreed. And Captain, do make sure Mr. Blackwood is there to witness it. After all, he's invested so much in your talents. Bishop's surprise at hearing Blackwood's name was quickly masked, but not before Rebecca caught it. Until dawn, then, he said, tightly wheeling his horse around. As Bishop and his men departed, Rebecca remained where she was, counting slowly under her breath. Only when they were well out of sight did she allow herself to relax marginally. That went as well as could be expected. She murmured to Eclipse, patting his neck before turning him toward the concealed path that would take them to the rendezvous point. The plan was in motion. Bishop, driven by pride and obsession, had agreed to exactly what she'd hoped for, a public confrontation that would focus all attention on the meadow at dawn. Meanwhile, the real operation could proceed unimpeded. At the rendezvous, a hidden cave system 3 miles from her burned-out ranch, Rebecca found Samuel, Sarah, and Marshall Walker waiting anxiously. He took the bait, she reported, dismounting. And Blackwood? Walker asked. Bishop didn't confirm, but his reaction when I mentioned the name told me everything I needed to know. Rebecca accepted the canteen. Samuel offered, "What's the status on our side?" "Judge Morrison is on his way to Fort Richardson with the evidence," Sarah replied. "Michael and his sons are escorting the remaining families to the Northern Valley. Eli and the Chen riders are monitoring Bishop's reinforcements. They're a day out at most." Rebecca nodded. "And the supply caches, has Bishop's men found any?" "2 of the smaller ones," Samuel acknowledged, "but the main ones remain secure. We can hold out another 4 days if necessary." Marshall Walker looked troubled. "This contest Bishop proposed, you're not actually considering it, are you?" Rebecca began checking her weapons methodically. "Of course I am. It's exactly what we need. Bishop focused on me while the rest of you implement the real plan. It's suicide," Walker argued. "Even if you could match him shot for shot, his men would never let you leave that meadow alive." Who said anything about matching him? Rebecca replied, a dangerous gleam in her eye. I beat him once before, David. I can do it again. That was 10 years ago in an exhibition with rules and judges. Walker persisted. This will be different. Rebecca's expression hardened. You think I've spent the last 8 years just running a ranch? Thomas understood what kind of world we lived in. He made sure I practiced every day, not for show, but for survival. Sarah intervened before the argument could escalate. There's something else you should know. One of Bishop's wounded men that we treated let something slip. Blackwood isn't just after the silver deposits. He's already sold shares in a mining operation to Eastern investors. If he doesn't deliver the land, he faces ruin and possibly prosecution, which makes him even more dangerous. Samuel observed. Rebecca absorbed this new information, adjusting her mental calculations. It also makes him vulnerable. Men like Blackwood value reputation above all else. If we can expose his methods publicly, he might cut Bishop loose to save himself. Walker finished, use him as a scapegoat. Exactly. Rebecca spread out the valley map. Tomorrow's confrontation isn't just about Bishop and me. It's about forcing Blackwood into the open, making him witness his operation unraveling firsthand. As they refined the plan's details, Rebecca felt the familiar calm that had always preceded her most dangerous performances. The stakes were immeasurably higher now, but the underlying principles remained the same: precise timing, flawless execution, and the absolute conviction that hesitation meant failure. Tomorrow at dawn, she would face not just Bishop's guns, but the culmination of a decade of hatred. The Midnight Raven would perform one last time, not for applause, but for justice. Long overdue, Serpent Ridge loomed dark against the pre-dawn sky as Rebecca made her final preparations. The meadow where she would face Bishop lay quiet and mist-shrouded below, surrounded by rock formations that created natural gallery seats for what was to come. The patrol confirmed Bishop's men are taking positions around the meadow. Samuel reported, his voice low. At least 20 of them, plus the reinforcements that arrived during the night. Rebecca nodded, adjusting the special ammunition belt Thomas had designed years ago, each bullet loaded with precise charges for exceptional accuracy. And Blackwood. He's there, Samuel confirmed, set up like he's attending a sporting event. Brought a chair, even has servants serving coffee. A grim smile touched Rebecca's lips. Perfect. He thinks he's about to witness the end of the Midnight Raven and the removal of the final obstacle to his plans. She checked the action on her Colts one last time. Any word from Judge Morrison? Nothing yet, Samuel replied, but he should have reached Fort Richardson by now. Rebecca glanced at the lightening eastern sky. It's time. Remember your positions. No matter what happens down there, hold to the plan. Samuel's weathered face showed his concern. Rebecca, I know, she interrupted gently, but this is how it has to be. Bishop's fixated on me. Let's use that. Before mounting Eclipse, she surveyed the gathered defenders, friends and neighbors who had stood with her against overwhelming odds. Each understood their role in what was to come, each committed to seeing it through. Whatever happens, she told them, Blackwater Valley does not fall today, not to Bishop, not to Blackwood, not to anyone who thinks they can simply take what others have built through hard work and sacrifice. With that, she swung into the saddle and guided Eclipse toward the path leading down to the meadow. The stallion moved with fluid confidence, sensing the importance of the moment. The meadow was larger than it appeared from above, perhaps 200 yards across, ringed by rock formations and sparse trees. At the far end stood Bishop, resplendent in a modified cavalry uniform that emphasized his military bearing. Beside him, seated on a folding chair beneath a small canopy, Harold Blackwood observed her approach with clinical interest. Rebecca halted Eclipse 30 yards away, taking in the scene with the experienced eye of a performer. Assessing a venue, Bishop's men were positioned strategically around the perimeter, visible enough to be intimidating, hidden enough to suggest there were more lurking unseen. You came, Bishop called out, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. I half expected you to flee in the night. And miss this performance, Rebecca replied evenly. After you've gone to such lengths to arrange it, that would be ungracious. Blackwood rose from his chair, approaching to stand beside Bishop. Up close, his patrician features betrayed a cold calculation that his public persona carefully concealed. "Mrs. Morgan," he greeted her with forced cordiality. "A pleasure to finally meet the woman who has caused such disruption to regional development." "Mr. Blackwood," Rebecca acknowledged him with a slight nod. "How interesting to find you here so far from your Helena offices. One might almost think you had a personal stake in Captain Bishop's vengeance." A flicker of annoyance crossed Blackwood's face. "I'm merely an observer. Captain Bishop's operations fall under legitimate business concerns." "Legitimate?" Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call forged army orders, corrupted officials, and murder for profit?" Blackwood's composure slipped further. "Careful, Mrs. Morgan. Your position is precarious enough without adding slander to your difficulties." Bishop, clearly impatient with the exchange, drew their attention back to the matter at hand. "The terms are simple," he announced. 5 targets increasing distances, best score wins, and the stakes." Rebecca inquired, though she already knew. Bishop's smile was cold. "If you win, which you won't, you and your remaining neighbors can leave the valley unmolested. If I win, you acknowledge defeat publicly, surrender your property, and the Midnight Raven becomes nothing more than a footnote in frontier history." Rebecca surveyed the meadow once more, noting the crude targets that had been set up at intervals ranging from 30 to 100 yards. The rising sun cast long shadows across the grass, creating pockets of brightness and deep shade that would challenge any shooter's ability to adjust quickly. "Well then," she said, dismounting gracefully, "let's not keep your audience waiting." The first round was almost insultingly simple stationary targets at 30 yards. Both Rebecca and Bishop hit the dead center with apparent ease, though Rebecca noted how Bishop's stance had changed from the exhibition in St. Louis. His movements were stiffer, less fluid, betraying years of harboring bitterness rather than honing skill. The second round increased both distance and difficulty, moving targets suspended from ropes swinging in the light morning breeze. Again, both competitors scored perfect hits, though Rebecca's shots grouped more tightly. By the third round, 70 yards with partially obscured targets, Bishop's confidence was visibly growing. His shots remained accurate, and the approving murmurs from his men fed his certainty that victory was at hand. Rebecca, meanwhile, performed with the composed precision that had once made her famous. Each shot was deliberate, each movement economical. To the observers, she appeared to be merely holding her own against Bishop's skill, but those who knew her best would have recognized that she was conserving energy, waiting for the right moment. The fourth round pushed the distance to 90 yards, approaching the effective limit for handguns. Bishop went first, scoring 5 hits, but with visible strain. When it was Rebecca's turn, she paused, studying the targets with unusual care. "Problem, Mrs. Morgan?" Blackwood called out, his tone suggesting he expected her to falter. "Not at all," Rebecca replied, simply appreciating the moment. Her first 4 shots matched Bishop's clean hits, well placed. But as she raised her Colt for the final shot, a disturbance erupted at the edge of the meadow. One of Bishop's sentries burst from the tree line, shouting urgently, "Captain Riders approaching from the North Army Patrol, full company strength." The news sent a ripple of tension through Bishop's men. Blackwood rose from his chair, expression darkening. "What is this?" he demanded. "You assured me there would be no interference." Bishop's composure cracked. "There shouldn't be. The fort commander was paid to redirect patrols away from this area for the week." Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. "Perhaps your arrangements aren't as reliable as you thought, gentlemen." Before either could respond, more shouts came from the eastern perimeter. 2 of Bishop's men dragged a struggling figure into the clearing. Sarah Garrett, her medical bag still clutched in one hand. "Found her trying to circle behind our position," Captain 1 reported. "Had this on her." He held up a packet of documents that Rebecca recognized immediately, copies of the evidence they'd collected against Blackwood. Bishop seized the papers, scanning them rapidly. His face twisted with fury as he turned to Rebecca. "You planned this." "I planned many things," Rebecca acknowledged calmly, "though I'd have preferred Sarah wasn't part of this particular development." Blackwood snatched the documents from Bishop, his cultivated veneer finally cracking completely as he read. "This is outrageous. These papers are stolen, the allegations fabricated. Are they? Rebecca countered. Or are they simply inconvenient truths about how you've built your empire? Mr. Blackwood forged army orders, bribed officials, orchestrated accidents for those who wouldn't sell. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, though still some distance away. Blackwood turned to Bishop, his voice low and dangerous. Fix this now. Bishop hesitated only briefly before barking orders to his men. Secure the perimeter. No one enters, no one leaves. He turned to Rebecca, drawing his pistol. This performance is over, Raven. Rebecca met his gaze unflinchingly. On that, Captain, we agree. With a motion too swift for most eyes to follow, she drew her second Colt and fired not at Bishop or his men, but at a specific rock formation at the edge of the meadow. The bullet struck a small pile of explosive charges that Samuel and Michael had positioned during the night, triggering a controlled avalanche. The distraction was momentary but sufficient. Rebecca grabbed Sarah, pulling her toward cover, as Bishop's men scrambled to respond to the new threat. Eclipse trained to respond to specific whistles charged toward them through the confusion. But Bishop had not survived a military career without developing hair-trigger reflexes. His shots cracked out, one grazing Rebecca's shoulder, the other striking Eclipse's flank. The stallion faltered, though he continued toward them. Get to cover! Rebecca shouted to Sarah, returning fire to provide cover. Her shots were precisely aimed, disabling rather than killing, forcing Bishop's men to seek shelter rather than pursue. Immediately, Sarah reached the relative safety of the rocks, but Rebecca's path was cut off by a collapsing section of the bluff. She changed direction, whistling for Eclipse to follow, when a second explosion rocked the far side of the meadow unplanned. Unexpected. Through the dust and confusion, Rebecca saw Blackwood shouting orders to a separate group of men who had not been part of Bishop's force, mercenaries professionally outfitted and moving with disciplined purpose. They were heading directly for the northern pass, the evacuation route the Valley's families had been using. He's had a backup plan all along. Rebecca realized, redirecting her course to intercept them. Bishop, recovering from the initial chaos, spotted her movement. She's getting away. 10,000 to the man who brings me her head. The carefully orchestrated confrontation had descended into violent chaos. The plan had accounted for many contingencies, but not Blackwood's separate force of mercenaries professionals who weren't part of Bishop's revenge-driven operation, but focused solely on securing the valley regardless of cost. Rebecca reached Eclipse, who was bleeding but still strong. She swung into the saddle, assessing their options rapidly. The original plan was now untenable, but the core objective remained: stop. Blackwood exposed the conspiracy, save the valley. Samuel and several defenders had emerged from hiding positions, engaging Bishop's men to create a diversion. Marshal Walker appeared at the meadow's edge, leading a small force of deputies and volunteers. But the approaching army patrol was still minutes away, and Blackwood's mercenaries were already moving toward the vulnerable evacuation route. Rebecca faced an impossible choice: help her friends fight Bishop's forces here, or pursue Blackwood's mercenaries to protect the evacuating families. Personal vengeance against Bishop or protection of the innocent. The Midnight Raven would have chosen the showdown. Rebecca Morgan chose protection. Samuel. She called out, directing Eclipse toward the rocky path leading to the northern pass. Blackwood's heading for the families. I'm going after him. Certainly, Shuon. Samuel nodded grimly, understanding, passing between them without words. They had prepared for many scenarios, but now improvisation was their only option. As Rebecca galloped away from the meadow, pushing Eclipse. Despite his wound, she heard Bishop's enraged shouts behind her. The obsessed captain had finally realized that once again she had outmaneuvered him, choosing the valley's people over personal vindication. The plan had been derailed, but the real battle was just beginning. And this time it wasn't about a shooting contest or an old grudge. It was about stopping Blackwood before his mercenaries reached the vulnerable families, caught in the crossfire of his ambition. Eclipse's powerful strides ate up the rugged terrain as Rebecca pushed him toward the northern evacuation route. The stallion's breathing was labored, his wound leaving a sporadic trail of blood, but his spirit remained unbroken. Behind them, sounds of gunfire echoed from the meadow, Samuel and the others engaging Bishop's forces to buy her time. They crested a rise overlooking the winding trail that led to the northern valley below. Rebecca could make out Blackwood's mercenaries, 8 men moving with military precision, led by a figure she recognized as Blackwood's personal secretary. They had perhaps a 20-minute head start, but were hampered by unfamiliarity with the terrain. Rebecca guided Eclipse down a steep slope that the mercenaries had bypassed, shaving precious minutes off the pursuit. Years of living in Blackwater Valley had taught her every shortcut, every hidden path knowledge she now leveraged to full advantage. "Just a little further, boy," she murmured to Eclipse, feeling his strength beginning to flag. The wound in her own shoulder throbbed with each hoofbeat, but she pushed the pain aside, focusing only on the urgency of their mission. Ahead lay Widow's Pass, a narrow defile between towering rock walls where the evacuation route bottlenecked. If Blackwood's men reached it first, they could trap the valley's families in a killing zone. Rebecca had to get there ahead of them, or at least create enough of a diversion to allow the civilians to escape. She cut through a dense stand of pine, emerging onto a ridge that paralleled the mercenaries' path. Through gaps in the trees, she could see them more clearly now, well-armed professional moving with the coordinated efficiency that only came from formal training. These weren't Bishop's revenge-driven former soldiers. They were hired killers who would execute their contract without question or hesitation. Rebecca drew one of her Colts, calculating angles and distances. She was too far for reliable accuracy with a handgun, especially from horseback, but precision wasn't her immediate goal. Selecting a rocky outcropping just ahead of the mercenaries, she fired twice. The bullets struck the rock face, sending fragments and dust showering down on the path. The mercenaries immediately took cover, weapons ready, scanning for the threat. Rebecca had already moved on, using the momentary distraction to gain ground. A fork in the trail presented a critical decision point. The left path led directly to Widow's Pass and was shorter but more exposed. The right wound through denser forest, adding time but offering concealment. Rebecca knew the mercenaries would expect her to take the covered route, so she chose the direct approach, gambling that Eclipse's speed could outweigh the risk. The gamble nearly proved fatal. As they emerged from a bend in the trail, rifle fire erupted from a position ahead. Blackwood had anticipated her move, stationing 2 men to cover the approach. Rebecca reacted instinctively, guiding Eclipse into a shallow gully beside the trail as bullets kicked up dirt around them. Drawing both Colts, she returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to pin down the ambushers while she assessed her options. The gully offered minimal protection and no path forward. The main force of mercenaries would be closing in behind her, and the 2 ahead had effectively blocked the direct route to Widow's Pass. Eclipse was tiring, his wound taking its toll, and her own injury had begun to bleed more heavily. A lesser rider might have surrendered to the impossible situation. Rebecca Morgan, who had once performed death-defying feats for cheering crowds, saw only a challenge to overcome. Holstering one Colt, she extracted something from her saddlebag, a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth that Thomas had insisted she always carry. Inside were 3 items he'd created specifically for her smoke charges, designed to create momentary cover. Rebecca lit the first charge and threw it toward the ambusher's position. Thick gray smoke billowed outward, obscuring their line of sight. Before they could adjust, she lit the second charge and tossed it in the opposite direction, creating the impression of multiple attackers. In the confusion, she urged Eclipse up the steep bank of the gully, away from both the trail and the ambushers. The ascent was treacherous, loose rocks sliding beneath the stallion's hooves, but he responded to her guidance with the trust born of years together. They reached the ridgeline above the trail just as the smoke began to dissipate. Rebecca could see the ambushers cautiously emerging from cover, uncertain whether she had fled or was preparing another attack. More importantly, she could now see Widow's Pass a half-mile ahead, and the first wagons of the evacuation convoy just entering its narrow confines. "There's no time," she whispered to herself, assessing the situation with cool precision. The main force of mercenaries would reach the pass within minutes. The families were completely exposed, with Michael and his sons positioned at the far end. Unaware of the approaching threat, Rebecca made her decision. Rather than continuing along the ridge to warn the convoy, she would create a diversion, become the target that drew the mercenaries away from the civilians. It was a sacrificial move, one that risked everything on a single desperate gamble. Guiding Eclipse to a position directly above the trail, she waited until the mercenaries had regrouped below. Then, with a shrill whistle that echoed across the valley, she revealed her position. "Looking for me, gentlemen?" she called down, ensuring they recognized exactly who was addressing them. "Mr. Blackwood must be paying well for you to work this hard." The mercenaries immediately opened fire, but Rebecca had already wheeled Eclipse around, racing along the ridgeline in the opposite direction from Widow's Pass. She fired her remaining smoke charge behind her, both to cover her retreat and to signal the convoy that danger approached. The ruse worked. The mercenaries abandoned their direct route to the pass, instead pursuing Rebecca with single-minded determination. Behind her, she heard their leader shout orders to split forces, 4 continuing. After her, 4 still heading toward the pass. Not a complete success, but enough to improve the odds. Rebecca pushed Eclipse to his limits, guiding him down a treacherous scree slope toward Thunder Canyon, a deep gorge that cut across the northern valley. If she could reach the rope bridge that spanned it, she might be able to cross and cut the ropes before her pursuers could follow. Eclipse, despite his injury and exhaustion, responded with heart. They reached the canyon rim, with the mercenaries still 2 minutes behind, enough time to cross the swaying bridge, if everything went perfectly. But perfection was not to be found that day. As they approached the bridge, Rebecca saw that her plan had a fatal flaw. The narrow crossing, designed for individuals on foot, would never support Eclipse's weight. She would have to abandon her faithful companion to continue. Rebecca dismounted, swiftly removing Eclipse's saddle and bridle. "Go!" she urged, slapping his flank. "Find Samuel." The stallion hesitated, unwilling to leave her. Rebecca used a training command Thomas had taught him, and with a reluctant snort, Eclipse finally turned and galloped along the canyon rim, away from the approaching mercenaries. Rebecca started across the bridge, moving as quickly as she dared on the swaying ropes. Behind her, the first of her pursuers appeared at the canyon edge, raising his rifle. She dropped to a crouch as his shot splintered the wooden slat near her foot. Halfway across, she paused. The mercenaries would be on the bridge soon, and there wouldn't be time to cut the ropes completely when she reached the other side. Drawing her knife, Rebecca began sawing at the main support rope, while still balanced precariously on the bridge itself. The first mercenary stepped onto the bridge just as the rope began to fray. "Stop or I'll shoot." He called out, his rifle aimed at her head. Rebecca met his gaze calmly. "Either way, this bridge is coming down. Your choice whether you're on it when it happens." The man hesitated just long enough. With a final stroke of her blade, Rebecca severed the rope. The bridge collapsed beneath them, sending both plummeting toward the canyon floor. 30 feet below, Rebecca's last conscious thought was of Thomas and how he'd always told her that sometimes survival meant embracing the fall rather than fighting it. Then darkness claimed her. Consciousness returned to Rebecca in painful fragments. First came sensation, cold water lapping at her legs, the sharp ache of bruised or broken ribs, the sticky warmth of blood on her face. Then sound, the gurgle of the shallow creek that ran through Thunder Canyon, distant gunfire echoing off stone walls. Finally, sight, dappled sunlight filtering through the bridge wreckage, the canyon walls rising steeply on either side. She was alive, though how remained a mystery. The fallen bridge had partially broken her fall, and the creek had softened her landing. The mercenary who had followed her onto the bridge lay motionless nearby, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. Rebecca took inventory of her condition with clinical detachment. 2, possibly 3 cracked ribs, a deep gash along her hairline that had bled profusely but was already clotting. Various bruises and abrasions. Her left ankle protested when she tried to stand, suggesting a sprain rather than a break. Most concerning was her shoulder wound, which had reopened and now throbbed with the telltale heat of potential infection. But she was alive, and that meant she still had a chance to complete her mission. Retrieving her Colts from the creek bed, Rebecca checked their condition. One had been damaged in the fall, its cylinder jammed with silt. The other, while wet, appeared functional. She ejected the waterlogged cartridges, replacing them with spares from her belt. The continued sound of gunfire from above suggested that the remaining mercenaries were engaging someone, likely Michael Whitford's group from the evacuation convoy. They must have spotted the pursuers and taken defensive positions. Rebecca examined the canyon walls, searching for retry. Claude hit the max length for a message and has paused its response. "You can write. Continue to keep the chat going. In continue edit, I'll continue crafting the original narrative based on your instructions." Rebecca examined the canyon walls, searching for a way up. The sheer rock faces offered few handholds, But years spent on Thomas's ranch had taught her more than just shooting. She'd learned to navigate terrain that would defeat most city dwellers. A narrow fissure in the eastern wall provided just enough purchase for determined hands and feet. The climb was excruciating. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through her injured ribs and shoulder. Twice she nearly fell when loose rock gave way beneath her boots. But the sounds of battle above drove her onward. People who had stood with her were fighting, perhaps dying while she struggled in this rocky prison. Sweat-soaked and trembling with exhaustion, Rebecca finally hauled herself over the canyon rim. She lay flat for several moments, allowing her vision to clear and her breathing to steady. The gunfire had grown more sporadic, concentrated around a cluster of large boulders 300 yards to the north. Through her remaining Colt sight, Rebecca assessed the situation. Michael Whitford and 3 others had taken defensive positions among the rocks, pinned down by the mercenaries who had split into pairs to flank them. Beyond just visible through the trees, the evacuation convoy had halted at the mouth of Widow's Pass. Rebecca checked her ammunition, 6 rounds in the Colt, another 12 in her belt, plus the knife at her hip. Not enough to win a direct confrontation, but perhaps enough to shift the balance. Moving low through scrub brush, she circled behind the nearest pair of mercenaries. They were focused entirely on Michael's position, unaware of the threat approaching from their rear. Rebecca closed to within 20 yards before making her move. "Gentlemen," she called out, her voice carrying just enough to reach them without alerting their comrades. "I believe you were looking for me." Both men spun, weapons raising, but Rebecca had already squeezed the trigger. The first shot struck the nearer man's rifle, numbing his hands and sending the weapon spinning away. The second caught the other mercenary in the shoulder as he tried to bring his pistol to bear the impact, knocking him backward. Before either could recover, Rebecca was on them. A swift kick disarmed the wounded man, while she grappled with the first, using his own momentum to drive him face first into a boulder. He slumped unconscious, blood streaming from a broken nose. The wounded mercenary staggered to his feet, drawing a knife. "You bitch!" he snarled, lunging forward. Rebecca sidestepped, catching his wrist and twisting sharply. The knife fell from nerveless fingers as bones snapped. A final blow to the temple sent him sprawling beside his companion. "Been called worse," she muttered, retrieving their weapons and ammunition. The skirmish had drawn attention. One of the other mercenary pairs broke off their attack on Michael's position. Moving to investigate, Rebecca melted back into the brush, circling to approach the evacuation convoy. She found them in disarray, 3 wagons and nearly 20 people, mostly women and children, with only Eli Chen and 2 older men standing guard. Sarah Garrett moved among them, tending to an injured child. "Rebecca," Sarah gasped, spotting her blood-streaked figure emerging from the trees. "We thought you—" "Not yet," Rebecca interrupted. "Michael and the others are pinned down about 300 yards south. We need to get these people moving." Sarah's medical training asserted itself as she quickly examined Rebecca's injuries. "You shouldn't even be standing," she admonished, pressing a clean bandage to the shoulder wound. Later, Rebecca insisted, turning to Eli. "How many of Bishop's men followed the convoy?" "None that we've seen," the young man replied. "We heard shooting back at the meadow, then more from the direction you came." Rebecca nodded grimly. "Bishop and Blackwood have split their forces. They're no longer working together." A renewed burst of gunfire punctuated her words. Michael's group was running out of time. "Eli, get these wagons moving fast as you can," Rebecca ordered. "Take the high trail through Morgan's Pass. It's longer but safer." She handed him the mercenaries' rifles. "Use these if you have to." "What about you?" Sarah demanded. Rebecca checked the borrowed pistols she'd taken from the mercenaries. "I'm going back for Michael and the others." You'll never make it alone," Sarah argued. "You can barely walk, let alone fight." "I won't be fighting," Rebecca replied, her expression hardening. "Not directly." Before Sarah could protest further, Rebecca was moving again, pain pushed aside by the urgent need for action. She circled wide around the mercenaries' position, seeking higher ground that would give her the advantage. A rocky promontory offered the perfect vantage point. From here she could see all the combatants clearly, Michael and his defenders, the mercenaries who had them trapped, and beyond them, the distant figure of Blackwood himself, observing from horseback at the edge of the tree line. Rebecca leveled the borrowed rifle, drawing a bead on Blackwood. At this range, perhaps 200 yards, the shot was challenging, but within her capabilities, even in her injured state, one squeeze of the trigger would end the threat permanently. Her finger tensed, then relaxed. Killing Blackwood wouldn't stop his operation, just transfer control to whoever backed him. They needed him alive facing justice, his crimes exposed to the light of proper legal proceedings. Instead, Rebecca shifted her aim to the trees beside Blackwood. Her shot shattered a branch inches from his head, sending splinters flying. The mining magnate jerked in startled panic, nearly falling from his horse. The distraction was enough. Michael's group seized the opportunity to break cover, firing rapidly to suppress the mercenaries, while retreating toward the evacuation route Rebecca provided. Covering fire, carefully placing shots to create confusion rather than casualties. Blackwood, abandoning dignity, entirely spurred his horse into the woods, fleeing the unexpected threat. Two mercenaries broke off to follow him, while the others continued their attack with redoubled fury, realizing their quarry was escaping. Rebecca expended her remaining ammunition to cover Michael's retreat, then descended from her position as quickly as her injuries allowed. Her vision swam alarmingly as she reached level ground, blood loss and exhaustion taking their toll. She stumbled forward, determined to follow Michael's group to safety, when a familiar voice froze her in place. "Hello, Raven." Rebecca turned slowly to find Edmund Bishop standing 20 paces away, his uniform torn and bloodied, but his stance still military straight. His pistol was leveled at her chest, his eyes cold with the culmination of 10 years' obsession. "It ends here," he stated simply. "No audience, no rules, just you and me, as it should have been in St. Louis." Rebecca weighed her options with the clarity that comes from accepting one's mortality. Her weapons were empty, her body was failing. There was nowhere to run, no trick to employ. "You've gone to a lot of trouble for this moment, Captain." She observed, her voice steady despite everything. "Was it worth it, all the lives destroyed, all the innocents harmed, just to settle a personal score?" Bishop's expression flickered. "This was never just about you. Blackwood offered what the Army took from me: command, purpose, respect. And in return, you became his butcher." Rebecca finished, "Clearing land for his mines by burning out families who had done nothing to you. Collateral damage." Bishop dismissed, though something in his eyes suggested the justification rang hollow even to him. Stand there and die with dignity, or run and die like a coward. Your choice. "Raven." Rebecca straightened, ignoring the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. "My name," she said clearly, "is Rebecca Morgan." Bishop's finger tightened on the trigger just as a shot rang out from the trees behind him. He staggered forward, a look of profound surprise crossing his features as blood blossomed on his chest. He turned, firing blindly into the woods before collapsing to his knees. From the trees emerged Samuel, chin rifle still raised. "Thought you might need some help," he said, simply moving to Rebecca's side as Bishop toppled face first into the dirt. "Michael?" Rebecca asked, leaning heavily against Samuel as her strength finally gave out. "Safe, everyone's moving through the high pass now." Samuel examined her injuries with concern. "You look terrible." A weak laugh escaped her. Always the charmer, Samuel. He helped her toward the evacuation route, both of them aware that Bishop's remaining men might regroup at any moment. "Blackwood?" he asked, ran. Rebecca replied, each step an exercise in determination over agony. But not far enough. Not anymore. As they crested the rise leading to Morgan's Pass, Rebecca paused for one last look at Blackwater Valley. Smoke rose from several points: her ranch, the Whitford place, others she couldn't identify. The beautiful landscape she and Thomas had chosen for their future now bore the scars of greed and vengeance. But the valley itself endured, as did its people. And that, Rebecca decided, as darkness finally claimed her, was victory enough for one day. Rebecca awoke to the scent of pine smoke and medicinal herbs. Pain greeted her first, a symphony of complaints from her battered body, followed by the recognition that she was alive to feel it. She opened her eyes to find herself in an unfamiliar cabin, sunlight streaming through oil paper windows. "About time," Sarah's voice came from nearby. The young doctor moved into view, professional concern, warring with relief on her face. 3 days is a long time to keep people waiting. 3 days, Rebecca croaked her throat, sandpaper dry. Sarah helped her sip water from a tin cup. You lost a lot of blood. Infection had set in. For a while it was uncertain. Memory returned in fragments, the canyon fall, the firefight, Bishop's death. The others, safe mostly. Sarah's expression clouded. We lost Jacob Turner and young Harrington. 4 others wounded, but they'll recover. Rebecca absorbed the news, grief settling heavily on her chest. And Blackwood escaped initially. Sarah's tone shifted, professional detachment, giving way to grim satisfaction. But Marshal Walker caught up with him at Fort Richardson. He's in custody, along with 3 territorial officials implicated in his schemes. Relief washed through Rebecca, though it couldn't displace the sorrow for those lost. The evidence. Judge Morrison delivered it personally to the federal marshal in Helena. Blackwood's entire operation is exposed. The forged documents, the bribed officials, everything. Rebecca tried to sit up, wincing as her body protested. Sarah immediately moved to assist her, adjusting pillows to support her injured frame. Eclipse. Rebecca asked, dreading the answer. The stallion had been wounded, exhausted when she'd sent him away. Alive, Sarah assured her. Samuel found him the day after. Everything, he's healing like you. Sacre, the cabin door opened, admitting Samuel and Eli Chen. Both men's faces broke into relieved smiles at seeing Rebecca awake. Told you she was too stubborn to die, Samuel remarked to his son, though the moisture in his eyes belied his light tone. Rebecca attempted a smile that became a grimace as pain lanced through her ribs. Where are we? Hunter's cabin, Samuel replied. About 10 miles north of the valley. It was the safest place to bring everyone while things settled. In the valley, Samuel's expression grew serious. Bishop's remaining men fled once word of Blackwood's arrest spread. The army sent a proper patrol to secure the area. He hesitated. But there's been damage, Rebecca. Your place, the Whitfords, 6 others burned to foundations. Rebecca nodded slowly, having expected as much. And the families, starting to return. Eli spoke up. Armies helping with temporary shelters. Judge Morrison's arranged for emergency supplies. A knock at the door heralded Marshal Walker's arrival. The lawman removed his hat upon entering, his weathered face bearing new lines of exhaustion. Mrs. Morgan, he greeted her formally. Good to see you among the living. Heard you caught Blackwood, Rebecca replied. Good work, David. Walker shook his head. Shouldn't have been necessary if I'd paid attention to what was happening in the territory months ago. He trailed off, regret evident in his voice. We all miss pieces. Rebecca absolved him. What matters is what we do now. Walker nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. That's partly why I'm here. Governor sent a federal investigator to assess damages, arrange compensation. He'd like to speak with you when you're able. Rebecca exchanged glances with Sarah, who shrugged reluctantly. Tomorrow, perhaps. She needs rest. There's something else, Walker added more hesitantly. Words spreading about what happened. The Midnight Raven's return is becoming quite the story. Rebecca sighed. She'd known this might happen, had even counted on Bishop's obsession with her former persona to distract him from their real strategy. But she'd hoped the legend might be laid to rest, along with the man who dragged it back into the light. Let them talk, she said finally. Stories fade, truth endures. When Walker had departed, promising to return with the federal investigator the following day, Rebecca asked for a moment alone. The others withdrew reluctantly, Sarah issuing stern instructions about not attempting to move without assistance. In the quiet of the small cabin, Rebecca finally allowed herself to process everything that had happened. The physical pain was manageable. She'd endured worse injuries during her performing days, but the emotional toll was heavier. People had died. Homes had been destroyed, all because a bitter man couldn't forget a decade-old humiliation, and a greedy one saw an opportunity to exploit it. Yet amidst the grief and loss, something unexpected had emerged. The residents of Blackwater Valley had united against a common threat, revealing a community bound by deeper ties than mere geography. In facing Blackwood and Bishop's forces, they'd discovered their collective strength. Rebecca's reflections were interrupted by the sound of hooves approaching. Moments later, the cabin door opened to admit Michael Whitford, his usual robust presence diminished by fatigue and a bandaged arm. "Heard you were finally awake," he said, settling heavily onto a stool beside her bed. "Figured I'd see for myself." "I'm hard to kill," Rebecca replied, studying his worn features. "How are your boys?" "Healing. James took a bullet in the leg, but Sarah says he'll walk fine once it mends." Michael's expression grew solemn. "Wanted to thank you, Rebecca. Without your warning, your plan we'd have lost more than buildings." Rebecca shook her head slightly. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Michael agreed. "That's the point, isn't it? None of us could have stood against them alone together." He shrugged, then winced as the movement pulled at his own injuries. "Together we sent them running." After Michael departed, Rebecca drifted between wakefulness and troubled dreams. Images from the past days mingled with memories from her performing career, the roar of crowds becoming gunfire, the flash of stage lights transforming into muzzle flare. Through it all ran Thomas's voice, steady and reassuring, reminding her that life's purpose wasn't found in dramatic moments, but in daily choices to protect what mattered. The following morning brought the promised federal investigator, a precise, earnest young man named Phillips, who documented Rebecca's account with meticulous care. He seemed particularly interested in the connections between Blackwood's mining operation and the territorial officials who had facilitated it. "The governor is most disturbed by these revelations," Phillips explained, reviewing his notes, "particularly the misuse of Army resources and the falsification of official documents. Is the governor disturbed enough to ensure compensation for the families who lost everything?" Rebecca asked pointedly. Phillips had the grace to look abashed. "That is part of my mandate. Yes, to assess damages and arrange appropriate restitution." When he departed, promising to return with formal documents for her to sign, Rebecca was left feeling vaguely unsatisfied. Justice through paperwork seemed somehow inadequate after all they had endured. Later that day, supported by Samuel and Sarah, Rebecca managed to sit outside the cabin for the first time since her injuries. The mountain air was crisp with approaching autumn, the distant peaks already dusted with early snow. "Marshall says we can return to the valley tomorrow," Samuel informed her. "Army secured the area, run off the last of Bishop's strays." Rebecca nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And then what rebuild pretend none of this happened?" Sarah exchanged concerned glances with Samuel. "Rebecca, no one expects—" "I know," Rebecca interrupted gently. "I'm just processing." The truth was more complicated than she could express. Part of her, the woman who had built a life with Thomas, who had found peace in the valley's rhythms, yearned to return to rebuild what had been lost. But another part, the part that had stepped back into the Midnight Raven's boots, so readily recognized that some things once broken could never be restored to their original form. Eclipse's approach broke her reverie. The stallion, his flank bandaged but his spirit undiminished, nickered softly as Samuel led him to Rebecca. She raised a hand to stroke his velvet muzzle, drawing strength from his solid presence. "He's been restless," Samuel explained. "Wouldn't settle until he knew you were all right." Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile since awakening. "We understand each other, don't we, boy?" That evening, as the residents of Blackwater Valley gathered around campfires to share meals and memories, Rebecca felt herself standing at a crossroads. The Midnight Raven had emerged from retirement to face Bishop's threat, and in doing so, had saved lives. But that persona had also contributed to the conflict, had been the catalyst for Bishop's destructive obsession. Rebecca Morgan, widow rancher neighbor, had found something different in the crisis, not glory or reputation, but the profound connections formed through shared struggle, the quiet strength of a community that refused to be driven from their homes, the resilience that came not from individual heroism, but from collective determination. As she watched the firelight play across the faces of those who had stood with her, Samuel's quiet dignity, Sarah's fierce compassion, Michael's stubborn resolve, and dozens of others who had risked everything to protect their shared home, Rebecca began to understand that identity wasn't a choice between who she had been and who she had become. It was the integration of all her experiences, the scars as well as the triumphs. Penny, for your thoughts. Samuel said, settling beside her with 2 cups of coffee. Rebecca accepted one gratefully. Just realizing that some mirrors once broken can't be put back together the same way. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. Maybe they're not meant to be. Maybe the broken pieces make something new, something that reflects light differently. The wisdom in his simple observation struck her deeply. Thomas had often said similar things when speaking of his own transformations from soldier to rancher, from lone survivor to husband and community member. As night deepened around the camp, Rebecca made her decision. The Midnight Raven had served her purpose, had emerged when needed most, but the legend belonged to the past. The future, whatever shape it might take, would be built by Rebecca Morgan, with all the complexities and connections that name now carried. Tomorrow they would return to the valley to begin rebuilding, not to restore what had been lost, but to create something new from the broken pieces. Something stronger, more connected, that would reflect light differently than before. And in that reflection, perhaps both Thomas and the Midnight Raven could find peace. Dawn mist clung to the grass as the caravan of wagons and riders descended into Blackwater Valley. Rebecca, still too weak to ride independently, shared a wagon seat with Sarah Eclipse, tethered behind them. From this vantage, the valley looked peaceful, almost unchanged until they drew closer to the settlement areas. Here the scars of Bishop's campaign were starkly visible. Charred ruins marked where homesteads had stood. Fields lay, trampled fences shattered. The general store at the valley's center was reduced to blackened timbers, and the small church beside it had lost its steeple. Yet amidst the destruction, signs of renewal had already emerged. Army tents dotted the landscape, providing temporary shelter. A communal cooking area had been established near the creek. Men and women moved purposefully among the ruins, salvaging what could be saved, clearing what could not. Their wagon halted at the edge of what had been Rebecca's ranch. Nothing remained of the home Thomas had built, just a scorched foundation, and the stone chimney standing like an accusing finger against the sky. The barn had fared slightly better, its structure partially intact, though heavily damaged. "You don't have to do this today," Sarah said gently, noting Rebecca's rigid posture. "We could stay in town until—" "No," Rebecca interrupted. "I need to see it. All of it." With Samuel's assistance, she descended from the wagon, leaning heavily on a walking stick. Each step sent pain lancing through her still healing body, but the physical discomfort was secondary to the grief that washed over her as she moved through the ruins of her life with Thomas. The cabin's scorched foundation held memories in every blackened board: the kitchen where they'd shared quiet evenings, the porch where they'd watched countless sunsets, the bedroom where she'd held his hand as fever claimed him. All gone now, reduced to ash and char. Rebecca knelt painfully, sifting through the debris near where their bedroom had stood. Miraculously, a small metal box emerged from the ruins. Thomas's strong box, its contents protected from the flames. Inside lay deeds, bank documents, and a sealed envelope addressed to her in his familiar handwriting. "He knew," she murmured, tucking the unopened letter into her pocket. Somehow he knew this day might come. As she continued her inspection, others arrived. Michael Whitford and his sons, the Harrington family, several of the smaller landholders from the Outer Valley. They gathered respectfully at the edge of the property, waiting until Rebecca acknowledged their presence with a nod. "We've been talking," Michael began without preamble, "about rebuilding." Rebecca studied the faces before her, people who had fought alongside her, who had faced loss equal to or greater than her own. And we think we should do it differently this time," Michael continued. "Not just put everything back the way it was." Judge Morrison, who had arrived with Marshal Walker, stepped forward. "What Mr. Whitford is trying to articulate is a proposal for centralizing the valley's essential services. A proper town center with defenses that could be maintained collectively." Rebecca understood immediately, "so that what happened with Bishop can never happen again." "Exactly," Samuel confirmed. "Individual homesteads remain independent, but core resources, the store, the school, medical facilities, would be centralized, more easily protected." The proposal made tactical sense, but Rebecca sensed something deeper beneath it, a shift in how the valley's residents viewed themselves. No longer isolated homesteaders who occasionally cooperated, but members of a true community with shared responsibilities and protections. "You'll need land for this town center," she observed, centrally located, accessible to all. Michael nodded. That's partly why we're here. Your property, what was your property, sits at the valley's crossroads. It would be ideal. Rebecca felt a complex surge of emotions. The land had been hers in Thomas's dream, their private sanctuary. Yet even before the destruction, she had begun to recognize how interconnected their lives were with their neighbors. Thomas himself had always emphasized the importance of community bonds. This would be more than just rebuilding, Sarah added quietly. It would be creating something new, something stronger. Rebecca thought of her conversation with Samuel by the campfire, broken mirrors reflecting light differently. Perhaps this was what he had meant. Thomas would have approved, she said finally. He always said isolation was the frontier's greatest danger. The relief on the gathered faces was palpable. They had feared her refusal, her retreat into grief and privacy. Instead, they found a woman willing to transform personal loss into collective opportunity. Over the next hours, as Rebecca's strength allowed, they walked the property together, envisioning what might be built on the ashes of what had been a proper street, with businesses, a schoolhouse that could double as a meeting hall, a dedicated medical clinic for Sarah, living quarters for those who preferred proximity to isolation. Throughout the discussion, Rebecca remained largely silent, absorbing their ideas while contributing occasional insights. Her mind was elsewhere, on the letter in her pocket, on the future taking shape before her, on the complex legacy of the Midnight Raven that still hung in the air around them. That evening, as the others returned to the army camp for the night, Rebecca remained behind, with only Samuel for company. They sat before a small fire built near the foundation of her former home, the stars emerging overhead in the deepening twilight. "You don't have to stay here tonight," Samuel said, concern evident in his voice. "The army tents are more comfortable than the ground, especially in your condition." Rebecca shook her head. "I need this time to say goodbye properly." Samuel nodded. "Understanding. I'll keep watch then." When he had moved a respectful distance away, Rebecca finally withdrew Thomas's letter from her pocket. The paper was yellowed with age, the seal unbroken. Whatever message he had left her had waited patiently, perhaps for just this moment of transformation. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet. "My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, then what I've long feared has come to pass. The past catches up to all of us eventually, no matter how carefully we build our new lives. From the day we met, I knew who you truly were, not just the Midnight Raven of legend, but the woman beneath the performance. I saw your strength, your compassion, your unyielding spirit. I knew those qualities would be needed someday, not just by me, but by all who call this valley home. You may feel now that everything we built has been lost. It hasn't. What matters most, the community we help nurture, the bonds between neighbors who become family. These endure even when buildings fall and fields burn. I don't know what form the threat took, but I know this. You met it as you've met every challenge in your life, with courage, intelligence, and the quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly who you are. The Midnight Raven was never just a stage name. Love, it was a promise of justice, protection, and a refusal to surrender to those who would harm the innocent. Those qualities belong to Rebecca Morgan just as much as they ever did to the performer. Whatever comes next, remember that we build lives not through grand gestures, but through daily choices to stand for what matters. The future of our valley now rests with you and those who stood beside you when darkness fell. With all my love and faith, Thomas. Rebecca folded the letter carefully, tears tracking silently down her face. Even from beyond the grave, Thomas had understood what she was only now beginning to grasp. That identity wasn't a mask to be worn or discarded, but a continuous evolution shaped by choices and connections. As the fire crackled before her, Rebecca made her decision. The land that had been her private sanctuary would become the heart of a new community. The skills that had made her famous would be taught to those who wished to learn them. The legacy of the Midnight Raven would be transformed from individual legend to collective strength. And Rebecca Morgan herself would neither retreat into isolated grief nor return to the spotlight of celebrity. She would find a different path, one that honored both who she had been and who she was becoming. With that resolution settling like bedrock beneath her, Rebecca finally allowed exhaustion to claim her, sleeping dreamlessly beside the remains of one life and the foundations of another. Winter yielded reluctantly to spring, and Blackwater Valley snow lingered in shadowed ravines even as new grass emerged in sun-warmed meadows. 5 months had passed since Bishop's attack, and the landscape itself seemed determined to heal its scars. Rebecca stood on a small rise overlooking what locals had begun calling Crossroads, the nascent town center, taking shape on her former property. Rough-hewn buildings lined the newly established main street. The general store had been rebuilt first, followed by a proper schoolhouse. Sarah's clinic occupied the eastern corner, its white-painted exterior a beacon of hope and healing. "Quite a change," Marshall Walker observed, joining her on the hillside. "Hard to believe it's the same place." Rebecca nodded, leaning lightly on her walking stick. Her physical injuries had mostly healed, though the damaged shoulder still ached in cold weather, and she suspected it always would. Judge Morrison's caravan just crossed the South Ridge. Walker continued, "Brings the final legal documents establishing the town charter and property arrangements, and news of Blackwood's trial." Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer from recent telegrams. Walker's expression darkened. 5 years less than he deserved, but more than his wealthy friends expected him to serve. His mining empire's been dismantled, at least. Rebecca accepted this with quiet resignation. Justice was rarely perfect, especially for men with Blackwood's connections. But his exposure had sent shockwaves through territorial politics, forcing reforms that would make similar schemes more difficult in the future. They descended together toward Crossroads, where the valley's residents had gathered to receive the judge's caravan. The community had changed in more ways than physical construction. Faces that had once been merely familiar were now bonded by shared survival. Former competitors cooperated on building projects. Resources that had once been carefully hoarded were now willingly shared. Samuel Chen greeted them at the edge of town, his weathered face creased in a rare smile. "Quite a turnout," he observed, nodding toward the crowded street. "Everyone's eager to make it official." Rebecca surveyed the gathering with mixed emotions. The legal establishment of Crossroads represented both an ending and a beginning, the formal transition from scattered homesteads to organized community. Her role in this transformation remained uncertain, a question she had deliberately left unanswered while focusing on practical needs. Judge Morrison's arrival temporarily suspended such reflections. The elderly jurist descended from his carriage with the assistance of his nephew Tommy, now officially appointed as town deputy. Behind them came a wagon bearing not just legal documents, but supplies funded by the territorial government, tools, seed building materials allocated as compensation for the valley's losses. The ceremonial proceedings unfolded on the newly constructed porch of the general store. Morrison read the town charter aloud, officially establishing Crossroads, Montana Territory as a recognized municipality with defined boundaries and governance structures. "And now," the judge announced, "we must address the matter of leadership. According to territorial statute, a settlement of this size requires an appointed mayor to serve until proper elections can be held." A murmur ran through the crowd. This aspect of official recognition had been discussed in private conversations, but never publicly resolved. After consultation with territorial authorities, Morrison continued, "And in recognition of extraordinary service during recent difficulties, I am pleased to appoint Rebecca Morgan as the first mayor of Crossroads." The announcement sent a shockwave of surprise through Rebecca. She had been consulted about many aspects of the town's establishment, but had explicitly avoided discussions of formal leadership roles. Her gaze sought Samuel's, finding only calm acceptance in his expression. He'd known this was coming. Before she could formulate a response, Michael Whitford stepped forward. "Judge Morrison, with all due respect, this appointment should be put to a community vote. Mrs. Morgan has served us well, but formal governance is another matter entirely." Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude toward Michael. Despite their occasional disagreements, he understood her reluctance to step into an official position of authority, but others had different ideas. Sarah Garrett moved to stand beside Rebecca. "I second the appointment," she stated firmly. "No one has demonstrated more commitment to this valley's welfare." "The Midnight Raven saved us all," called someone from the crowd, triggering a wave of agreeing voices. Rebecca raised her hand, silencing the growing debate. I appreciate Judge Morrison's confidence, she said carefully, and the support of those who approve his choice. But Michael is right. Leadership of Crossroads should reflect the community's will, not territorial appointment. She turned to face the gathered residents directly. More importantly, the woman who helped during the crisis was Rebecca Morgan, not the Midnight Raven. That distinction matters. The legend belongs to the past, a performer who worked alone, who lived for applause. What happened here, what we accomplished together, came from something deeper than legend. Her words settled over the crowd like gentle rain sinking into soil, long prepared to receive them. Many nodded understanding, particularly those who had fought alongside her. I propose this, Rebecca continued. Let Judge Morrison establish a temporary council drawn from representatives of all parts of the valley. In 6 months, when recovery is further along, proper elections can determine more permanent leadership. Morrison stroked his beard thoughtfully. An unorthodox suggestion, but legally sound. What say you, citizens of Crossroads? The response was overwhelmingly positive. Even Michael looked satisfied with the compromise. Within the hour, a 5-person council had been established. Samuel Chen, representing the Eastern Valley, Michael Whitford, the South, Sarah Garrett, the town center itself, and 2 others representing the northern and western reaches. Rebecca, deliberately absent from the council, found herself oddly unburdened as she watched the new governance take shape. For months she had carried the weight of the valley's recovery, had been the focal point for decisions large and small. Stepping aside felt not like abdication, but like the natural evolution of what she had helped create. As the formal proceedings concluded and the gathering transformed into an impromptu celebration, Rebecca slipped away, leading Eclipse along the newly cleared path toward the small cabin she now occupied at the valley's edge. The simple structure, built with help from her neighbors, sat on a rise overlooking both Crossroads and the sprawling landscape beyond, a position that suited her emerging role perfectly. Samuel caught up with her, halfway matching his stride to her more measured pace. You knew about the appointment, she stated rather than asked. Morrison consulted me last week. He admitted, I told him you'd refuse. Rebecca smiled faintly. Yet he tried anyway. Sure, anyone. The territorial government wants to associate itself with the Midnight Raven's triumph over corruption. Samuel explained, your appointment would have made a compelling narrative. Politics, Rebecca sighed, always about the story rather than the truth. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, the sounds of celebration fading behind them. Finally, Samuel spoke again, more hesitantly. The council will still need your guidance, Rebecca. Your experience, your perspective. Somehow they'll have it, she assured him. But from the right distance, the valley doesn't need a legend or a formal leader. It needs what it's always had: people who understand that true strength comes from standing together. Samuel studied her with quiet perception. You found your answer then. About what comes next? Rebecca glanced back toward Crossroads, where lanterns were being lit against the gathering dusk. I think so. Not the Midnight Raven, not exactly Mayor Morgan. She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. Something in between, something new. The path before them split, one fork leading to Samuel's ranch, the other to Rebecca's cabin. They paused at the junction, the moment waited with unspoken understanding. Thomas would be proud, Samuel said simply, of all of it. Rebecca nodded, emotion tightening her throat. He saw it coming. Left me a letter saying as much. Somehow he knew the past would catch up eventually. A wise man, your Thomas. Yes, Rebecca agreed softly. He was. As Samuel departed toward his own home, Rebecca continued along the path, Eclipse following, faithful behind. The stallion had recovered fully from his wounds, though like her he carried scars that would never completely fade. They had that in common, now visible reminders of survival against overwhelming odds. At the cabin, Rebecca settled on the small porch. Thomas's letter had inspired her to include in the design. From here she could see both the developing town and the wild country beyond, civilization and wilderness existing in balanced tension, much like the different aspects of her own identity. The Midnight Raven would always be part of her, just as Rebecca Morgan would always carry the grief of loss and the joy of connection that had shaped her life in the valley. The integration of these seemingly opposed elements wasn't a compromise, but a synthesis, something stronger and more authentic than either could be alone. As stars emerged overhead, Rebecca felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. The path ahead wasn't clearly marked, but the foundations beneath her feet were solid. Whatever came next, she would face it not as a legend or a widow or a mayor, but simply as herself, a woman who had learned that true identity wasn't found in labels, but in the choices made when everything that mattered hung in the balance. Summer painted Blackwater Valley in vibrant hues, golden wheat fields, emerald pastures, wildflowers scattered like jewels across the meadows. 1 year had passed since Bishop's attack, and the transformation was remarkable. Crossroads had evolved from desperate necessity to thriving center, with new buildings appearing monthly and regular freight service connecting it to larger settlements. Rebecca's role had evolved as well. Though she had refused formal leadership, her counsel remained sought after, particularly in matters of security and planning. She had established a regular training program, teaching basic marksmanship and self-defense to any who wished to learn. The skills that had once made her famous now served a different purpose, ensuring that the valley's residents could protect themselves and each other. On this particular morning, Rebecca stood in the corral behind her cabin, working with Eclipse on advanced riding maneuvers. The stallion responded to her subtle cues with the precision that came from years of partnership, executing complex turns and stops with ballet-like grace. Sarah Garrett, who had taken to visiting weekly under the pretense of checking Rebecca's healing injuries, watched from the fence rail. "Still the best rider I've ever seen," she observed, "sure you won't reconsider for the Founders' Day celebration." Rebecca guided Eclipse to a halt and dismounted fluidly. "Quite sure that chapter's closed. Sarah, the upcoming Founders' Day celebration, marking the first anniversary of Crossroads' establishment, had become a point of gentle contention. Many residents wanted Rebecca to perform to demonstrate the skills that had once made the Midnight Raven legendary. She had consistently declined, despite increasingly creative attempts to change her mind. "It would mean a lot to people," Sarah persisted, "especially the children. They've heard the stories but never seen what you can really do." Rebecca removed Eclipse's saddle, brushing his coat with practiced strokes. "The stories are better than the reality. Let them keep their legends intact." Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Is that what this is about? Preserving the legend?" Rebecca paused in her grooming, considering the question honestly. "No," she said finally. "It's about honoring who I am now, not who I was then. The Midnight Raven performed for applause, for reputation. Whatever I do now needs to serve something beyond myself." Before Sarah could respond, a rider approached at a gallop. Tommy Hayes, now sporting the official deputy's badge with earnest pride. "Mrs. Morgan," he called out, reining his horse to a stop. "Message from Marshal Walker, urgent." Rebecca accepted the folded paper, scanning its contents quickly. Her expression remained neutral, betraying nothing of the shock the message delivered. "Thank you, Tommy," she said evenly. "Please tell the marshal I'll be along shortly." When the deputy had departed, Sarah studied Rebecca with concern. "Bad news." Rebecca refolded the message carefully. "Bishop's former lieutenant, James Merritt. He's been released from territorial custody. What, how? Insufficient evidence, apparently, or more likely, connections in the right places." Rebecca's voice remained composed, but her eyes had taken on the focused intensity that Sarah recognized from the conflict months before. "He was Bishop's second-in-command, responsible for raids on 3 homesteads before they reached our valley." Sarah absorbed this with growing alarm. "Do they think he'll come here? Try to finish what Bishop started?" "Walker doesn't speculate," Rebecca replied, already moving toward the cabin. "But Merritt swore vengeance during his arrest. He blamed me specifically for Bishop's death." Inside, Rebecca opened the cedar chest that still contained remnants of her performing days. The black riding outfit had been modified, silver conchos replaced with practical reinforcements, flashy elements removed in favor of functionality. The matched Colts remained, though they too had been adapted for practical use rather than theatrical effect. "You're going after him," Sarah realized, her voice tight with concern. Alone, Rebecca continued her preparations with methodical precision. Not after him, to warn Walker help establish precautions. Crossroads is stronger now, better organized. If Merritt is foolish enough to attempt what Bishop failed to accomplish, he'll find a very different reception. Sarah wasn't convinced. Let me come with you, or at least take Samuel. You're needed here, Rebecca countered gently. And Samuel's coordinating the harvest preparations? This is reconnaissance. Sarah, not confrontation. When Rebecca emerged from the cabin dressed now in practical riding clothes with her weapons concealed but accessible, Sarah blocked her path. Promise me you won't face him alone. Promise me you'll remember what you just said about serving something beyond yourself. Rebecca met her gaze steadily. I promise. The ride to Marshal Walker's office in the larger settlement of Fort Ridge took most of the day. As mountainous territory gave way to rolling plains, Rebecca maintained a vigilant awareness of her surroundings. If Merritt had indeed set his sights on revenge, she presented an obvious target. Walker's office was situated on Fort Ridge's dusty main street, the building newer and more substantial than his previous headquarters. The marshal himself looked unchanged, the same weathered face and watchful eyes, though perhaps more lines creased his features than a year before. Wasn't sure you'd come, he admitted, closing the door behind her. Information about Merritt concerns more than just me, Rebecca replied, scanning the wanted posters and maps that lined his walls. What do we know about his release? Walker's expression soured. Official story is that evidence against him was circumstantial. Unofficial version is that he had helped same kind of political connections that nearly let Blackwood escape justice. In any indication of his whereabouts, nothing concrete, but there have been reports 3 men matching the description of Bishop's core group seen in Helena 2 weeks ago, then again near Benton Crossing. Walker indicated locations on his wall map, moving steadily in this direction. Rebecca traced the path with her finger calculations running behind her composed expression. How many men? 7, possibly 8, smaller than Bishop's force, but reportedly better armed. Quality over quantity, Rebecca murmured. Merritt was always the tactician. Bishop had the vision, but Merritt implemented it. Walker poured 2 cups of coffee, pushing one across his desk toward her. Territorial authorities have been alerted. There's a warrant for questioning, but nothing that allows for preventative detention. So we wait until he makes his move. Rebecca concluded, accepting the coffee, but not drinking. By which point people may already be dead. I've sent warnings to all settlements in the region, including Crossroads, suggested increased patrols, limited travel for the next few weeks. Walker studied her with concern. You should probably stay here for a while, Rebecca. You're his most likely target. Rebecca shook her head. That's exactly why I need to return. If Merritt wants me, I won't have him tearing through Crossroads to find me. At least take a deputy escort. And advertise my movements? No. Rebecca's tone was firm but not unkind. I appreciate the warning, David, but I've faced worse than James Merritt. As she rose to leave, Walker moved to block her path, much as Sarah had done earlier. Bishop was obsessed with the Midnight Raven. Merritt is different, colder, more calculating. He won't be drawn into the kind of personal confrontation Bishop wanted. I'm counting on that difference, Rebecca replied enigmatically. The return journey to Crossroads took her through increasingly familiar territory. As mountain peaks reclaimed the horizon, Rebecca felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. This landscape had become more than home. It had become part of her identity, as integral to who she was, as the skills she'd developed or the relationships she'd formed. Twilight was gathering as she approached the valley's entrance. The setting sun cast long shadows across the trail, creating pockets of deep darkness between patches of fading light. Rebecca was alert, but not alarmed when Eclipse suddenly tensed beneath her, his ears pricking forward. Easy, boy, she murmured, scanning their surroundings with practiced precision. The attack when it came was not what she expected. No gunfire, no shouted threats. Instead, a cleverly concealed tripwire caught Eclipse's forelegs, sending both horse and rider tumbling. Rebecca managed to kick free of the stirrups as they fell rolling away from the stallion's thrashing bulk to avoid being crushed. She came up with Colts drawn, but the hillside around her remained eerily silent. Eclipse struggled to his feet, snorting in distress but apparently uninjured. The tripwire hadn't been designed to harm, only to dismount. "Merritt!" Rebecca called out, her voice steady. "If you want to talk, show yourself." Silence answered her. Then from the gathering darkness, a single lantern flared to life, perhaps 50 yards up the hillside. It illuminated nothing but itself, a solitary point of light in the deepening gloom. Rebecca holstered one Colt, keeping the other ready as she moved deliberately toward the light. Eclipse followed several paces behind his movements, tense but obedient. As she approached, the lantern's glow revealed a small clearing where a man sat calmly on a fallen log. James Merritt appeared little changed from when she'd last seen him during the confrontation, a year before. The same lean physique and military bearing, though his formerly clean-shaven face now sported a neatly trimmed beard. "Mrs. Morgan," he greeted her with formal politeness. "Or do you prefer Midnight Raven? These days I hear the name has enjoyed a revival." Rebecca remained at the clearing's edge, Colt held discreetly at her side. "Merritt, you've gone to considerable trouble for this meeting. I wanted privacy for our conversation." He gestured to a second log opposite his position. "Please sit. My men have orders not to interfere unless I signal." "Your men?" Rebecca glanced around the darkened hillside, detecting no movement, but knowing his claim was likely true. Merritt had always been thorough. "Precautions only," he assured her. "Had you arrived with an escort, they would simply have withdrawn." "Ha, come." Rebecca weighed her options. Merritt appeared unarmed, though she knew better than to trust appearances. Still, if he'd wanted her dead, the tripwire could easily have been rigged differently. She approached cautiously, choosing to remain standing, rather than accept his offered seat. "What do you want, Merritt?" "Clarity." He replied simply, "Understanding." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. About what happened here last year. About why a woman of your considerable talents would choose this." He gestured toward the valley beyond. "Over the recognition you once commanded. About why Captain Bishop, a decorated officer and brilliant strategist, became so fixated on destroying you that he lost sight of every other consideration." The unexpected direction of his inquiry momentarily disarmed her. "You rode all this way, risked arrest for philosophical discussion?" Merritt smiled faintly. "I've had considerable time to reflect in territorial custody." "Mrs. Morgan, watching a man I respected destroy himself through obsession provides powerful motivation for self-examination." Rebecca studied him carefully, searching for deception and finding only a strange sincerity. Bishop lost perspective, allowed a single public defeat to consume him until vengeance became more important than reason. "Yet you defeated him again," Merritt observed, "not through superior firepower or tactical advantage, but by understanding what truly mattered to the people of this valley." Rebecca's suspicion deepened. "You seem remarkably philosophical about the death of your commander." "Former commander," Merritt corrected. "By the time you faced him in that meadow, Bishop was no longer the man I had followed. Blackwood's influence, combined with his own festering grievance, had transformed him into something unrecognizable." "And you," Rebecca asked directly, "Walker believes you're here for revenge." Merritt's expression remained unnervingly calm. "I considered it, planned it in detail during those first months of imprisonment, but eventually I realized that continuing Bishop's vendetta would only complete the destruction of everything I once valued about my military career. Honor, purpose, proportional response." He reached slowly into his coat, freezing when Rebecca's Colt rose instantly to target his chest. "Just retrieving something to show you," he explained carefully. Rebecca nodded, once one weapon still trained on him. Merritt withdrew an official-looking document, holding it toward the lantern light so she could read its heading. "Territorial pardon, conditional terms." "My release wasn't political," he explained. "It was conditional on cooperation. Everything I knew about Blackwood's operation, every detail of his corruption network, in exchange for commuted sentencing." Rebecca lowered her weapon slightly, pieces realigning in her mind. "You turned on Blackwood. I gave the territorial prosecutor what he needed to pursue higher-level targets." Merritt confirmed, "Men with influence far beyond what Blackwood possessed. The investigation continues, but 3 territorial senators have already resigned rather than face public exposure. The revelation shifted Rebecca's understanding of the situation entirely. Not revenge but redemption drove Merritt's return, a concept she understood better than most. "Why tell me this?" she asked, finally holstering her weapon completely. "Why risk coming here at all?" Merritt carefully refolded the document, his movements precise as his words. "Because I needed to see for myself what Bishop couldn't, what makes this place worth defending so fiercely, and because I owe you a debt, Mrs. Morgan." "A debt?" Rebecca repeated, genuinely confused. "You stopped me from becoming bishop." Merritt said simply, "From allowing bitterness to consume whatever honor I had left." He stood adjusting his coat with military precision. "The warning about my release was deliberately misleading my suggestion so I could speak with you before the territorial marshals announced my cooperation publicly." Rebecca absorbed the scales falling from possibility to probability in her mind. "And now I return to Helena to continue assisting the investigation. My future beyond that remains undetermined." Merritt extinguished the lantern, plunging them into near darkness, relieved only by starlight. "But I wanted you to know that at least one former enemy recognizes the wisdom of your choice, forsaking legend for something more meaningful, if less celebrated." As Merritt moved to depart, Rebecca asked one final question. "How many men do you actually have watching us right now?" A smile ghosted across his features, visible even in the dim light. "None, Mrs. Morgan? That was a calculated bluff, betting that you would approach cautiously regardless." Rebecca felt an unexpected laugh rise in her throat. "Bold strategy." "I learned from the best," Merritt replied, "both what to emulate and what to avoid." He vanished into the darkness, then moving with the silent efficiency that had made him Bishop's most effective lieutenant. Rebecca remained in the clearing for several minutes, processing the encounter's implications. When she finally remounted Eclipse and continued toward home, her thoughts were not of danger averted, but of unexpected parallels. Another soldier seeking to redefine himself beyond past mistakes. Another performer discovering that the most meaningful acts often went unwitnessed. The lights of Crossroads greeted her as she crested the final rise. The small town glowing with warmth against the night sky. Samuel Chen waited at the valley entrance, rifle resting casually against his shoulder. "Shakespearean trouble?" he asked simply as she approached. Rebecca shook her head. "Not the kind we expected." As they rode side by side toward town, Rebecca shared the details of her encounter with Merritt. Samuel listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "Redemption's a powerful motivator," he observed when she had finished, "though not everyone finds their way to it." Rebecca nodded, thinking of Bishop's final moments, a man so consumed by vengeance that even at the end, he couldn't recognize what he had become. Merritt made different choices when confronted with his failures. Chose a harder path ultimately. "As did you," Samuel pointed out quietly. The comparison startled her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. She too had faced a moment of reckoning, had chosen a direction that honored both past and future, without becoming trapped by either. They parted at the edge of town, Samuel returning to his ranch while Rebecca continued to her cabin. The encounter with Merritt had shaken loose something that had been gradually forming in her mind since the Founders' Day discussions, began an understanding of what her final performance might truly entail. The following morning, Rebecca sought out Sarah at the clinic. The young doctor looked up in surprise when Rebecca entered, clearly expecting further resistance regarding the celebration. "I've been thinking about your request," Rebecca said without preamble, "about performing for Founders' Day." Sarah set aside her medical texts, attention fully engaged, and "I'll do it," Rebecca stated, but not as the Midnight Raven, not as entertainment. "I don't understand." Rebecca settled into the chair opposite Sarah's desk. "The skills I developed weren't meant for show. Not originally. My father taught me marksmanship for practical purposes, hunting, self-defense. The theatrical elements came later when necessity forced me to earn a living." Sarah nodded slowly, beginning to follow her reasoning. "So instead of a performance, a demonstration," Rebecca finished. "Practical skills that others can learn, adapt for their own needs. Not to create new legends, but to ensure everyone in this valley can protect what matters to them." The idea took shape rapidly over subsequent days. What had begun as a simple decision evolved into a comprehensive program, not just marksmanship and riding, but tracking, navigation, basic survival techniques. Others joined the effort, contributing their own expertise. Samuel offered lessons in mountain craft, Michael Whitford in animal handling, the Harrington brothers in construction and repair. By the time Founders Day arrived, the original concept of a single performance had transformed into a community-wide exhibition of practical knowledge freely shared. Stations were established throughout Crossroads where residents demonstrated skills essential to frontier life. Children moved excitedly between them, collecting not just information, but a deeper understanding of self-reliance and interdependence. Rebecca's station, positioned at the town center, drew the largest crowd. Many came expecting theatrical tricks from the legendary Midnight Raven. What they received instead was a methodical demonstration of practical marksmanship, how to maintain weapons, how to shoot accurately under various conditions, how to use terrain for protection. The point isn't hitting impossible targets, she explained to the gathered audience. It's understanding that responsible skill serves a purpose beyond impressing others. To illustrate, she set up a series of practical scenarios, defensive positions, challenging angle situations that mirrored real threats rather than theatrical showcases. Her shooting remained exceptional, but the emphasis had shifted from spectacle to substance. As the day progressed, Rebecca noticed a subtle change in how people approached her. The awe that had often colored their interactions began to give way to something more valuable. Respect based not on legend, but on practical wisdom generously shared. The celebration culminated in a community gathering as sunset painted the valley in golden light. Tables laden with food filled the town square. Music from local fiddles and guitars created an atmosphere of genuine festivity. Children who had spent the day learning from various stations now proudly demonstrated their new knowledge to parents and grandparents. Judge Morrison, who had returned for the occasion, raised a glass in a formal toast. 1 year ago, this valley faced its greatest challenge. Today, we celebrate not just survival, but transformation. Crossroads stands as testament to what can be built when people recognize that true strength comes from standing together. Applause rippled through the gathering. Rebecca, seated beside Samuel at one of the communal tables, felt a complex emotion she couldn't immediately name. Pride certainly, but something deeper as well, a sense of rightness, of alignment between who she had been and who she had become. Later, as lanterns illuminated the continuing celebration, she found herself approached by an unexpected visitor. The territorial governor, a distinguished man in his 60s, who had arrived without fanfare during the afternoon, requested a moment of her time. "Mrs. Morgan," he began when they had moved to a quieter location at the square's edge, "I must congratulate you on what you've built here. Crossroads has become something of a model for the territory. Self-sufficient, well-organized, defended without being militaristic." "The community built itself," Rebecca corrected gently. "I simply contributed what I could." The governor smiled diplomatically. "Your modesty is admirable, but let's not pretend your role was insignificant, which brings me to my purpose in seeking you out." He produced an official-looking document from his coat pocket. "The Territorial Assembly has authorized me to offer you a formal position, Special Advisor on Settlement Security. Your expertise would be invaluable in helping other communities develop the kind of resilience Crossroads has demonstrated." Rebecca accepted the document, scanning its contents with careful attention. The position offered was substantial, good pay, significant authority, the opportunity to influence territorial policy. 5 years earlier, even 2, she might have considered it a validation of everything she had worked to achieve. Now she recognized it for what it was, another well-intentioned attempt to transform personal experience into public identity. "I'm honored by the consideration," she said, carefully returning the document to the governor, "but I must decline." Surprise registered briefly in the governor's expression. "May I ask why the position would not require you to leave Crossroads permanently, just regular travel to advise other settlements?" Rebecca's gaze drifted across the celebration, taking in the faces of people who had become much more than neighbors. Because what makes Crossroads work can't be legislated or formalized into policy. It comes from shared experience, mutual respect, recognition that independence and interdependence aren't opposing values, but complementary ones. Those insights are precisely why we need your voice in territorial governance. The governor persisted. Rebecca shook her head gently. My voice is where it needs to be here. Teaching what I know, learning from others in turn. Creating policy would distance me from the very experiences that give my perspective value. Though clearly disappointed, the governor accepted her decision with grace. The offer remains open should you reconsider. As he rejoined the celebration, Samuel appeared at Rebecca's side. Important man, the governor. He observed mildly. Seemed quite intent on your conversation. Rebecca summarized the exchange, including her refusal of the position offered. Samuel nodded thoughtfully, unsurprised by either the proposal or her response. You could have done good work in that role, he noted without judgment. Perhaps, Rebecca acknowledged, but at what cost? They stood in companionable silence, watching as the celebration continued around them. Children chased fireflies at the square's edge. Older couples danced to familiar tunes. Young men and women engaged in the timeless rituals of courtship, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. I finally understand what Thomas meant, Rebecca said softly, almost to herself. About performances and audiences. Samuel raised an inquiring eyebrow. The Midnight Raven performed for applause, for recognition. She explained, everything was about the immediate reaction, the gasps, the cheers, the validation of exceptional skill. She gestured toward the gathering before them. But this isn't a performance. It's not about me at all. It's about creating something that continues even when no one's watching, that serves a purpose beyond momentary appreciation. Samuel's weathered hand found hers squeezing gently. That's the difference between legend and legacy. The simple truth of his observation resonated deeply. Legends demanded constant retelling, required audiences and validation to sustain them. Legacy worked quietly, often invisibly shaping the future, through present actions that might never be celebrated or even noticed. The Midnight Raven had been an extraordinary performer, a legend by design. Rebecca Morgan was building something far less spectacular, but infinitely more valuable. A legacy embedded not in theatrical memory, but in the practical resilience of a community that would endure long after she was gone. As night deepened around Crossroads, Rebecca felt the last remnants of tension between her past and present finally resolve. The Midnight Raven would always be part of her story, a chapter worth honoring without being defined by it. But her final performance, her most meaningful performance, would never appear on any theatrical poster or elicit any applause. It was the daily choice to serve something larger than herself, to transform hard-won skills into shared knowledge, to build connections that transformed isolated individuals into a community capable of facing whatever challenges the frontier might bring. And unlike the stage spectacles of her performing days, this was a performance that would continue as long as Crossroads stood unheralded. Often invisible, but ultimately the only performance that truly mattered. Autumn painted Blackwater Valley in burnished gold and deep crimson. 5 years had passed since Founders Day, 15 months since Rebecca had finally agreed to serve on the town council, after 3 consecutive elections, where her name appeared on ballots despite her protests. Crossroads had grown steadily, not explosively, like some mining settlements, but with the measured pace of a community built to last. Rebecca stood on the porch of her cabin, watching as riders approached along the main trail. Eclipse, now showing clear signs of age, though still proud, nickered softly beside her. The stallion recognized the lead rider long before human eyes could discern details. Samuel Chen, returning from his monthly trip to Fort Ridge for supplies and mail. You're later than expected, Rebecca called out as he approached, noting the additional riders accompanying him. 2 men and a woman, all well dressed in Eastern fashion. Samuel dismounted with a grimace that spoke of aging joints, protesting long rides. At 62, his hair had gone completely silver, though his movements retained the fluid economy of someone who had spent decades mastering physical skills. Had to wait for the stage, he explained, nodding toward the strangers. These folks were most insistent about meeting you. Rebecca assessed the newcomers with practiced ease. The men wore the slightly uncomfortable expressions of city dwellers confronting frontier realities. The woman, however, met Rebecca's gaze directly, her posture suggesting confidence and determination. Mrs. Morgan, The woman began stepping forward and extending her hand. I'm Catherine Winters from the Chicago Tribune. These gentlemen represent Harper's Weekly and the New York Herald. Journalist Rebecca's expression cooled slightly. Over the years, various writers had made the journey to Crossroads seeking interviews about the Midnight Raven's last stand against corruption. She had consistently refused Ms. Winters. She acknowledged shaking the offered hand but not inviting them inside. You've come a long way for nothing. I don't give interviews. Catherine smiled undeterred. So we've heard, but our interest isn't in sensationalizing old legends. Mrs. Morgan, we're documenting the changing frontier, how settlements like Crossroads have succeeded, where others failed. Rebecca exchanged glances with Samuel, who shrugged slightly. You might want to hear them out. He suggested, brought some interesting news. Curiosity temporarily overriding caution, Rebecca invited them onto the porch. The journalist settled on the benches she'd built years ago, while Samuel leaned comfortably against the railing. Well, Rebecca prompted when no one immediately spoke. The older of the male journalists cleared his throat. Mrs. Morgan, are you aware that your community has become something of a model for territorial development policies? Rebecca raised an eyebrow. The governor mentioned something similar some years ago. It's gone beyond mention, Catherine Winters interjected. The Territorial Assembly recently passed what they're calling the Crossroads Ordinance legislation, establishing guidelines for new settlements based specifically on principles demonstrated here. The younger journalist added eagerly, community-centered planning, shared security responsibilities, integration of diverse skills and backgrounds, all explicitly attributed to Crossroads development under your guidance. Rebecca's surprise must have shown as Samuel smiled knowingly. Told you it was interesting news. I was merely one voice among many. Rebecca protested, the council, the residents themselves. Yet your influence is consistently cited by territorial officials. Catherine pressed, particularly your refusal to formalize your role. Your insistence that leadership should be shared rather than centralized. The conversation continued for nearly an hour with the journalists asking thoughtful questions about Crossroads development that suggested genuine research rather than sensation-seeking. Rebecca found herself responding more openly than she'd anticipated, though she deftly sidestepped any attempts to discuss the specific events involving Bishop and Blackwood. One last question, Catherine said as the interview drew to a close. Many communities established during this period have disappeared abandoned when mineral deposits proved insufficient or transportation routes changed. What makes you confident that Crossroads will endure? Rebecca considered the question seriously. Crossroads wasn't built on extracting value from the land, but on creating value through connection. She answered finally, gold runs out, silver tarnishes. But communities rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose, those can outlast any single resource or individual. After the journalists departed, escorted by Samuel to arrange accommodations in town, Rebecca remained on her porch watching as twilight gathered over the valley. The interview had stirred memories and reflections she usually kept carefully contained. 5 years had brought significant changes. Eli Chen had married Sarah Garrett's younger sister, their union symbolizing the deeper integration of the valley's diverse families. The Whitford boys had established a successful freight business connecting Crossroads to larger settlements. The school now served 80 children from throughout the region, its reputation for excellence drawing families from surprising distances. Yet some things remained constant. Rebecca still trained anyone who wished to learn marksmanship and self-defense, though her methods had evolved to accommodate her aging body. She still rode Eclipse daily, their roots growing shorter as the stallion's strength gradually diminished. She still maintained a watchful eye over the valley, though the threats they faced now were more often natural than human. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her reflections. Sarah appeared at the path's edge, medical bag in hand, for what had become a weekly ritual disguised as a social call. Saw the journalists in town, Sarah remarked, settling onto the bench Rebecca had vacated. Finally convinced you to tell your story. Not exactly, Rebecca replied, pouring coffee for them both. They were more interested in Crossroads than in old legends. Sarah accepted the cup gratefully. The years had added subtle threads of silver to her dark hair, and motherhood had softened her once angular features. At 38, she had become one of the most respected physicians in the territory, her clinic drawing patients from settlements 2 days right away. Speaking of old legends, Sarah began cautiously, "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." Rebecca recognized the tone professional concern lurking beneath casual conversation. "My shoulder again." "Among other things," Sarah set her cup aside. "Rebecca, you've been pushing yourself too hard lately. The training programs, the council duties, the patrol routes you still insist on riding personally. It's taking a toll." Rebecca started to dismiss the concern, but Sarah continued with professional firmness. "Your body has endured extraordinary demands even before Bishop's attack. The injuries you sustained that never fully healed couldn't given your refusal to rest properly." "I'm fine, Sarah." "You're exhausted," Sarah countered gently. "And in more pain than you admit. I'm your doctor, Rebecca. More importantly, I'm your friend. It's time to consider adjustments." The directness of Sarah's assessment struck harder than Rebecca had expected. She had become adept at disguising physical limitations, at pushing through discomfort to maintain the capability her role demanded. But Sarah's medical training saw what others missed: the subtle winces, the careful adjustments of position, the calculated conservation of energy. "What kind of adjustments?" Rebecca asked, finally. "Delegate more. Train others to continue your programs. Consider that perhaps Crossroads no longer needs you to be its constant guardian." The suggestion touched a deeper fear than Rebecca had acknowledged even to herself: the possibility of becoming irrelevant, of outliving her usefulness to the community she had helped build. "And if I'm not that," she asked quietly, "then what am I?" Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "The woman who taught us all that strength isn't about standing alone but standing together. The woman who showed an entire generation of girls that courage wears many faces. The woman who repeatedly chose service over celebrity when those choices actually mattered." Rebecca stared into the gathering darkness, absorbing Sarah's words. The younger woman had always possessed the gift of cutting through pretense to essential truth. "I'll consider it," she conceded finally. "No promises." Sarah smiled, recognizing the small victory. "That's all I ask." Their conversation shifted to community matters: the upcoming Harvest Festival, the school expansion, the latest territorial politics. But Sarah's observations lingered in Rebecca's mind, connecting to thoughts stirred by the journalist's questions about Crossroads' future. Later that night, unable to sleep, Rebecca found herself at her small writing desk, penning a letter she had contemplated for years, but never quite begun. The words flowed more easily than expected, perhaps because their intender, Claude, hit the max length for a message and has paused its response. "You can write, continue to keep the chat going, N, continue edit. I'll continue the narrative picking up exactly where I left off." Later that night, unable to sleep, Rebecca found herself at her small writing desk penning a letter she had contemplated for years but never quite begun. The words flowed more easily than expected, perhaps because their intended recipient would never read them. Thomas had been gone for 8 years now, but somehow his presence remained strongest in moments of transition. "I'm facing another change," she wrote. "Not by crisis this time, but by choice, the hardest kind of change for someone like me. You always said I struggled more with peace than conflict, with accepting rather than fighting. You were right as usual." Etched. She continued writing late into the night, filling pages with reflections on Crossroads' evolution, on her own journey from the Midnight Raven to Rebecca Morgan, and the integrated identity she had since created. When dawn's light finally spilled through her window, she sealed the letter and placed it in the cedar chest beside Thomas's last message to her. A conversation across time between two people who had recognized in each other the capacity for transformation. The weeks that followed brought subtle shifts in Rebecca's approach to her responsibilities. She began training Michael Whitford's granddaughter, a fierce 16-year-old, who showed remarkable aptitude for both riding and marksmanship, to lead the basic self-defense classes. She delegated certain council duties to younger members, eager to take on more responsibility. She adjusted her patrol routes to accommodate Eclipse's diminishing stamina. These changes, while seemingly small, represented a profound evolution in Rebecca's understanding of her role in the community. Leadership, she realized, wasn't about maintaining control, but about creating conditions where others could develop their own capabilities. The journalist's articles appeared in Eastern newspapers 2 months later, generating unexpected consequences. Letters began arriving from throughout the territory and beyond, some addressed to the legendary Midnight Raven, others to Mayor Morgan, a position she had never actually held, but most to Rebecca herself. People wrote seeking advice on establishing their own communities, on resolving conflicts, on balancing independence with collective security. "You've become an institution," Samuel observed one evening as they sorted through the latest batch of correspondence on her porch. Rebecca frowned at the characterization, hardly just someone who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. "Or the wrong place at the right time," Samuel countered with a smile. "Perspective matters." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of several riders, the town council's younger members led by Eli Chen. Their expressions suggested urgency rather than emergency. "Mrs. Morgan," Eli began once pleasantries had been exchanged. "We've been discussing the Territorial Assembly's new development initiatives." Rebecca nodded, familiar with the policies inspired by Crossroads' evolution. "What about them?" "They've requested that communities serving as models send representatives to the territorial capital next month," Eli explained. "A conference to share experiences, establish best practices for newer settlements." The unspoken question hung in the air. Rebecca sighed, recognizing the inevitable. "You want me to go?" "Actually," Sarah's younger sister Mary replied, "we all felt Eli should represent Crossroads. He was there from the beginning, but represents the generation that will carry the community forward." Rebecca felt a complex surge of emotions, pride in their thoughtfulness, relief at not being asked to travel, and a faint, surprising twinge of something like disappointment. "A wise decision," she said sincerely. "Eli understands Crossroads principles as well as anyone." After discussing the practicalities of Eli's journey, the council members departed, leaving Rebecca and Samuel in contemplative silence. "Not what you expected?" Samuel asked. Finally, Rebecca smiled ruefully. "That obvious? Only to someone who's known you as long as I have." Samuel's perceptive gaze held gentle understanding. "You're relieved, but also a little unsettled. They didn't need to ask you." "It's as it should be," Rebecca acknowledged. "The next generation taking responsibility for Crossroads' future." "The natural order," Samuel agreed. "Life continues, evolves. Our part in it changes." As autumn deepened toward winter, Rebecca found herself increasingly drawn to reflection. The 6th anniversary of Crossroads' founding approached, bringing with it a milestone she had not expected to find significant. She had now lived longer as Rebecca Morgan of Crossroads than as the Midnight Raven of the traveling shows. One crisp morning, she rode Eclipse to a high point overlooking the entire valley. The stallion moved more slowly now, white showing around his muzzle, but his spirit remained undimmed. From this vantage, Rebecca could see the full scope of what Blackwater Valley had become, the growing town at its center, surrounded by prosperous homesteads and well-tended fields. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in schoolyard wagons, moved along established roads. Nothing remained of the violence that had once scorched this landscape. No visible evidence of Bishop's obsession or Blackwood's greed. The only lasting effects were invisible, the community bonds forged through shared crisis. The determination to protect what mattered. The recognition that true strength came from standing together. "We did well, didn't we, boy?" Rebecca murmured to Eclipse, who flicked an ear in acknowledgement. The future would bring new challenges, certainly. The frontier was changing, railroads advancing territories, becoming states, the open spaces gradually yielding to settlement and governance. Crossroads would need to adapt as it always had. But Rebecca felt a profound certainty that the community would endure, not because of any individual's leadership, but because of the principles embedded in its foundation. Leadership distributed rather than concentrated, security through mutual protection rather than isolation. Progress measured by collective welfare rather than individual advancement. As she guided Eclipse back toward town, Rebecca felt the weight of unfinished business pressing on her thoughts. One final piece of her transformation remained incomplete, a personal matter rather than a public one, but no less significant. That evening, she removed the Midnight Raven's outfit from the cedar chest for what she knew would be the last time. The black leather remained supple, the specialized pockets and reinforcements intact. The matched Colts rested beside it, their ivory handles worn smooth by years of use. Rebecca packed these items carefully in oilcloth, adding the theatrical posters Samuel had preserved and the few newspaper clippings that documented her performing career. Tomorrow she would ride to Fort Ridge, where the Territorial Museum had expressed interest in creating an exhibit about frontier entertainment. The Midnight Raven belonged to history now not forgotten, but properly contextualized as part of a larger story about the evolving West. Not a legend that demanded continual retelling, but a piece of the past preserved with respect while life moved forward. Rebecca Morgan, meanwhile, had more immediate concerns: a winter to prepare for young people, to mentor a community, to serve in ways that honored her capabilities while acknowledging her limitations. The integration of past and present into a coherent identity was nearly complete, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quieter, deeper work of acceptance and purpose. As snow began to fall outside her cabin window, Rebecca felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over her. The path forward was no longer defined by what or who she had been, but by the daily choices that would shape whatever time remained. That she reflected as she banked the fire for the night was perhaps the most meaningful legacy of all. Not what history would remember about the Midnight Raven's last stand, but what those who knew Rebecca Morgan would carry forward in their own lives. Justice served not through spectacular confrontation, but through the patient building of something worth protecting. Courage demonstrated not in moments of mortal danger, but in the willingness to change when change was needed. Strength found not in standing alone against impossible odds, but in standing together through whatever came next. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Blackwater Valley in pristine white nature's own way of honoring the past while creating space for whatever the future might bring.